Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, here to guide you today. Many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, so before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now, settle in, get comfy, and let's begin. New story is coming. This happened in the late 1990s, specifically in 1997. I never imagined that my love for solitude would lead me into such a predicament. At the time, I was stationed at Olympic National Park in Washington State. My name is Thaddeus Langley, though folks just call me Thad. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, a place where a person can hear their own thoughts without the constant buzz of city life. Growing up in a small town taught me to appreciate the simple things, like a good cup of coffee and a bad joke. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what should have been a routine patrol through one of the less traveled sections of the park. The area wasn't popular with tourists, which suited me just fine. I packed my gear, just the essentials: a first aid kit, water, some trail mix, and a flashlight. As I shouldered my backpack, I caught a whiff of pine and damp earth, the smell of the forest awakening my senses. The canopy above was thick, filtering the sunlight into a soft green glow that made everything feel alive. The familiar crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots was oddly comforting as I ventured deeper into the woods. Birds chirped their morning songs, and occasionally I'd spot a squirrel darting up a tree trunk. A couple of hours into my hike, I stumbled upon something unusual. At first, I almost missed it, my eyes scanning the forest floor for any signs of disturbance. But as I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. On the trunks of several trees were deep gouges, claw marks, unlike anything I'd seen before. I approached the nearest tree and ran my fingers along the grooves. They were higher than any bear could reach and spaced too closely to be the result of antlers rubbing against the bark. The wood was splintered and torn, as if something with immense strength had raked its claws down the trunk in a frenzy. A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the day. I took a few photos with my phone, making a mental note to report it back at the station. But as I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual sounds of the forest birdsong and rustling leaves had fallen silent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I laughed at myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. "Get a grip, Thad," I muttered. "You're letting your imagination get the better of you." But even as I said the words, I couldn't quite convince myself they were true. As the day wore on, the silence became more pronounced. I found myself straining to hear any sound, a bird call, the scurrying of small animals, anything to break the eerie quiet. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet. Around midday, I reached a small clearing where I planned to have lunch. The open space should have been a relief after the densely packed trees, but instead, it felt exposed. As I unwrapped my sandwich, I noticed an unnatural stillness. No wind, no insects buzzing, nothing. I took a bite of my sandwich, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. My eyes kept darting to the tree line, searching for what, I didn't know. But every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a large figure darting between the trees, too fast for me to get a clear look. My heart leapt into my throat. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The figure had seemed too large, too wrong to be a deer. I decided it was time to head back. As I packed up, a pungent odor hit me like a physical force. It was a mix of wet dog and decaying meat, so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. Scanning the area, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. With shaking hands, I shouldered my pack and set off back down the trail. Every snap of a twig and every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, sure I was about to come face to face with something. But each time, there was nothing. On the trail back, I found footprints in the soft ground. They were huge, unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen before. They were elongated, with what looked like for toes ending in sharp points. I took a photo, my hands trembling as I held the phone. Whatever had made these prints was no ordinary forest creature. I pressed on, my pace quickening with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The light was fading now, shadows lengthening and deepening. Every shape seemed to hide a potential threat. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't human, but it didn't sound entirely animal either. It was a sound of rage and hunger, of something ancient and primal. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to pinpoint the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the trees. Then I saw it. A massive creature emerged from the shadows about 50 yards ahead. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, with matted fur the color of ash. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in clawed hands that looked capable of tearing through steel. Its head resembled that of a hyena, but grotesquely distorted jaws too large, teeth too numerous. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The creature locked eyes with me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Its sickly yellow eyes burned with an unsettling intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. This was no mindless beast. There was something horrifyingly human in its gaze. Then it snarled, peeling its lips back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and it charged. Instinct took over as adrenaline surged through my body. I turned and ran as fast as I could. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't dare look back. Behind me, branches snapped, and heavy footfalls grew louder. Its hot, rancid breath felt like it was just inches from my neck. Up ahead, I spotted a fallen tree leaning against a rocky outcrop, forming a small crevice. Without thinking, I dove into the gap, squeezing myself into the tight space. The creature thundered past, unable to stop its momentum. I pressed myself as far back into the crevice as I could, holding my breath. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would hear me. The sound of its movements slowed, and I heard it sniffing the air. It let out a guttural growl of frustration, a sound so primal it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I remained cramped and trembling. My muscles ached, but I didn't dare move. The creature paced back and forth, its claws scraping against the rocks. It knew I was nearby. Eventually, the noises faded, and the forest fell silent once more. I strained my ears, trying to determine if it was safe to emerge. The oppressive quiet of the forest offered no answers. Summoning every ounce of courage, I cautiously crawled out of my hiding spot. Every nerve in my body was on edge. The forest seemed different now, menacing. Shadows twisted and danced at the edges of my vision, and every sound made me flinch. I grabbed a sturdy branch and held it tightly. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. As I made my way back along the trail, I stumbled upon a scene that will haunt me forever. 3 hikers lay scattered across the path, their bodies torn and lifeless. Blood stained the ground, dark and rusty red. My stomach churned as I recognized one of them, Eric. He had checked in at the station that morning, eager to explore. His face was frozen in a mask of terror, his wide eyes staring at nothing. A surge of anger mixed with fear welled up inside me. These people never had a chance. Fumbling with my radio, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. "This is Ranger Langley," I said, my voice barely steady. "Emergency in Sector 4. We have casualties. I need immediate backup." The reply crackled through static, the words garbled. All I managed to make out was ... coming. Stay, before the line went dead. Knowing help might be on the way, I resolved to search for survivors. As I combed through the area, trying to ignore the carnage around me, I heard a faint groan. Hope surged through me, and I rushed toward the sound. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s, was alive barely. Deep gashes covered her torso, and her breathing was shallow. "Hang in there," I said, kneeling beside her and applying pressure to her wounds. "Help is coming. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. It came. Out of nowhere, she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "Just stay with me. You're going to be okay." She nodded weakly before her eyes closed again. I checked her pulse, praying for some sign of life, but there was nothing. She was gone. I sat back, my hands bloodied, and felt a wave of helplessness crash over me. These people had come to the park for adventure and beauty, only to meet a horrific end. Something had to be done. Every instinct told me to flee, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But I couldn't leave, not knowing it was still out there. Gathering my resolve, I decided to lure it away from any populated areas. It wasn't a brilliant plan, but it was the only one I had. I picked up another branch and fashioned a makeshift torch, wrapping it with dry grass and striking my lighter. The flame sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows around me. "All right, ugly," I muttered, trying to psych myself up. "Let's finish this." Waving the torch above my head, I shouted at the top of my lungs. My voice echoed through the forest, shattering the eerie silence. The creature didn't take long to appear. Its glowing eyes reflected the firelight with a sinister gleam as it stepped out from the shadows. It snarled, saliva dripping from its massive jaws, and charged again. This time, I stood my ground. At the last moment, I sidestepped and swung the torch, striking it across the face. The flames caught on its fur, and it recoiled, shrieking in pain and rage. Seizing the opportunity, I ran deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The creature followed, its roars filled with fury. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I kept going. Ahead of me, the ground dropped off sharply a ravine. I remembered from earlier patrols a steep drop into rocky terrain ahead. With the creature closing in, I knew I had one shot. I leapt across the gap, my body suspended in the air for what felt like an eternity. I landed hard on the other side, my ankle twisting with a sickening pop. A jolt of pain shot up my leg, but there was no time to dwell on it. Behind me, the creature skidded to a halt at the edge, its momentum nearly carrying it over. For a moment, it teetered, claws scrambling for purchase on the loose soil. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I saw something unexpected fear. Then, the ground beneath it gave way. The creature plummeted into the ravine below, its scream of rage morphing into one of terror as it fell. The sound echoed off the rocks before it was abruptly silenced. I limped to the edge, my heart pounding, and looked down. The creature lay motionless among the jagged rocks, its body twisted at unnatural angles. I couldn't tell if it was dead, but it wasn't getting up anytime soon. Exhausted and in pain, I turned back toward the station, using the trees for support. Every step was agony, but adrenaline kept me moving. As I emerged from the forest, I saw a team of rangers and emergency personnel waiting. Relief washed over me, and my legs finally gave out. "Thad, over here," someone called. I collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around me. Medics rushed over, checking my injuries and bombarding me with questions. My supervisor, Mark, knelt beside me, his face etched with concern. "What happened out there?" he asked urgently. "There's something in the ravine, about 2 miles east," I managed between labored breaths. "It attacked some hikers. They're gone." Mark exchanged glances with the others, his expression unreadable. "We'll send a team to investigate," he said. "Right now, let's get you taken care of." As they loaded me into an ambulance, I couldn't stop wondering what they would find or if they would find anything at all. The forest had kept its secrets for millennia. Who was I to think I could uncover them in a single day? A few days later, I returned to the station. My ankle was wrapped, my arm in a sling from scratches I'd sustained. The official report listed the incident as a bear attack, but I knew better. When I pressed the higher-ups about what they'd found in the ravine, they gave me the usual bureaucratic runaround. "Let it go, Thad," Mark advised one evening as we closed up the office. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was something there, fear, maybe, or resignation. He knew more than he was letting on, but for reasons I couldn't fathom, he wouldn't or couldn't share it. I decided to take his advice, at least for now. Fighting management was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wasted my time and annoyed the pig. That night, as I was leaving the station, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting shaky, but legible. It read, "Be careful in the woods. Not everything is as it seems. The old ones are waking." I chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "No kidding," I muttered, pocketing the note. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows, but the parking lot was empty save for my beat-up truck. As I drove home, the words from the note echoed in my mind. The old ones are waking. What did that mean? And who had left the message? A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. My encounter in the woods felt like the beginning of something far larger and more terrifying than I could comprehend. The next morning, despite my injuries and the lingering fear, I was back on patrol. As I walked the familiar trails, I kept my senses sharp, but the forest seemed normal again. Birds sang, leaves rustled in the breeze. It was as if the horrors of a few days ago had never happened, like a bad dream. About an hour into my patrol, Dave, another ranger, caught up with me. "Heard you had quite the adventure," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You could say that," I replied, unsure how much he knew. "Think about taking some time off?" He asked, his tone casual, though his eyes searched my face. I shook my head. "Nah, the trees would miss me too much." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're a glutton for punishment, Thad." "Better than a desk job," I shot back, trying to keep things light. We continued down the trail, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Life went on, as it tends to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held more secrets than I would ever know. As we reached a fork in the trail, Dave turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "You sure you want to keep doing this, Thad? After what happened?" I hesitated. The memory of the creature, its inhuman eyes, razor-sharp claws, and snarling maw flashed through my mind. But beneath the fear, there was something else, curiosity. A burning need to understand what was really going on in these woods. "I have a knack for finding trouble," I said finally, managing a wry smile. "Might as well put it to good use." Dave studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then. Adventure awaits." We headed down the path, the possibilities of the day stretching before us. Yet, as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite the bright afternoon sun. "Dave," I said quietly, not wanting to alarm him, "does anything feel off to you?" He glanced at me, his grin gone. "Yeah," he murmured. "It does." Dave's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. I was about to explain, when a sharp crack, a twig snapping, echoed from somewhere to our left. We both froze, our eyes scanning the dense underbrush. For a moment, the forest was utterly still, as if it too was holding its breath. Then, without warning, a figure burst through the trees. It was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes hung in tatters, his pale, mottled skin streaked with dark bruises. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were entirely black, no whites, no iris, just pools of inky darkness. "Help me," he rasped, stumbling toward us with jerky, unnatural movements, as if his body wasn't fully under his control. Dave instinctively took a step back, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. But before he could call for help, the man lunged at him with inhuman speed. I reacted on pure instinct, tackling the figure to the ground. The two of us tumbled, the smell of decay hitting me like a physical blow. I struggled to pin him, but his strength was impossible, far beyond what his frail, emaciated frame should have allowed. "Dave," I shouted, my voice strained, "get help." But Dave stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. The man, if he could still be called that, thrashed beneath me, his mouth opening unnaturally wide to reveal rows of jagged, sharpened teeth. Just as I felt my grip slipping, a gunshot rang out. The man's body went limp, and a dark, viscous fluid seeped from a hole in his head. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Dave stood there, his service weapon in hand, shaking violently. What the hell was that? He whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. The body on the ground was already starting to decompose at an alarming rate. Flesh melted away like wax under a flame, exposing bone beneath. We need to report this, Dave stammered, fumbling for his radio again. Before he could call, a strange, low hum filled the air. It was a pulsing sound, deep and resonant, that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air shimmered around us, distorting like heat waves on asphalt. Dave, I said, a note of urgency creeping into my voice. We need to leave. Now. He nodded, and we turned to run, but the forest around us had changed. The once familiar paths twisted into a labyrinth of shifting shadows and gnarled roots. The trees themselves seemed alive, closing in as if to trap us. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots caught at our feet, trying to trip us. The hum grew louder, drowning out the sound of our labored breaths and pounding footsteps. Then, the ground gave way beneath us. We tumbled down a steep incline, rolling over rocks and through underbrush, until we finally came to a stop in a clearing. I groaned, battered and bruised, as I pushed myself up. Dave was beside me, clutching his arm where a jagged tear in his sleeve revealed bloodied skin. The clearing was unlike anything I'd seen in the park before. A towering cabin stood near the edge of a small creek. It was weathered and ancient, the wood blackened with age and covered in moss. Despite its appearance, there was something unnatural about it. The air around the cabin was heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't quite explain. "What is this place?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, but my gut told me we shouldn't be there. The hum that had pursued us began to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a void, an emptiness that felt alive. I gestured for Dave to follow me as I limped toward the cabin. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but fear outweighed the discomfort. The door creaked open with an unsettling ease, revealing a dark interior illuminated only by faint shafts of moonlight streaming through broken windows. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed, but the room didn't feel abandoned. There was something here watching. We stepped inside cautiously. The floor creaked under our weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange objects, bottles filled with murky liquids, carved wooden idols, and bundles of dried herbs that gave off a faint, acrid scent. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an open book, its pages covered in strange symbols I couldn't decipher. "What is this?" Dave muttered, reaching for the book. "Don't touch it," I hissed, grabbing his arm. Before we could decide our next move, a sound shattered the silence, a low growl, guttural and wet, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. My blood turned to ice. "We need to leave," I whispered. But as we turned to go, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into darkness. I figured it was probably a deer or a bear. I'd had a few run-ins before, nothing too serious, but something felt off. It was that gnawing uneasiness you can't shake once it settles in your gut. I grabbed my rifle, an old Winchester .30-30 that had been my companion in these woods for decades. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring as I stepped off the porch, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The forest was unnaturally quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. But tonight, the woods were utterly still, as though they were holding their breath. I let it go, chalking it up to my imagination. Living out here, you hear things all the time. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. I went back inside, thinking the night was over. But just as I closed the door, there it was again, this time closer. I hesitated, my heart thudding against my ribs, and listened to the stillness settle over the woods. The sound wasn't moving away, it was getting nearer. I turned off the lights inside and peered out the window. The forest was dense, shadows crowding the spaces between trees, and without a clear line of sight, I couldn't see much. But I could feel something. Something was out there, watching. I'm not one to spook easily, not after years living in isolation. I've seen wolves stalk prey through these woods and heard coyotes howl under the moon. But this was different. The silence was unnatural, the air charged with tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back onto the porch, gripping the rifle tightly. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the stillness to loud, to human. Silence, the kind that stretches too long. Then, movement. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded by shadows. It didn't move like a person, it was too still, as though it was trying to blend into the darkness. I raised the rifle, aiming at the figure. "I don't know who you are, but I suggest you turn around and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart was racing. I'd dealt with trespassers before, poachers or drifters looking for shelter, but this wasn't that. This felt wrong. The figure took a step forward, slow, deliberate, then another. My pulse quickened. That primal, gut-deep fear clawed its way up my spine. Something was telling me to run. The figure stopped about 20 yards from the porch, and now I could see it more clearly. Its limbs were thin, impossibly long, like something out of a child's nightmare. Its skin was pale and translucent in the moonlight, tinged with a sickly gray that made my stomach churn. It was naked, but its body was twisted, a grotesque parody of human form. And its face was worse. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets, dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth was a thin, lipless line stretching unnaturally wide, almost ear to ear. And then, as I watched, it smiled. That smile will haunt me forever. It wasn't human, not joy, not warmth. It was a predator's grin, rows of needle-sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. I pulled the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The figure flinched, a dark stain blooming on its chest where the bullet struck, but it didn't fall. I know I hit it. I've been a good shot since I was a boy, but the thing barely reacted. Everything went still again, the kind of eerie silence where the world seems to hold its breath. Then it moved faster this time. It lurched toward me, gliding across the ground with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette controlled by an unsteady hand. I fired again, and again. Each shot rang out, the recoil biting into my shoulder, but no matter how many bullets I put into it, the creature kept coming. Panic surged through me. This wasn't possible. Nothing could take that many shots and keep moving. I wasn't sticking around to find out what it wanted. I turned and bolted inside, slamming the door behind me and bolting it with trembling hands. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, rifle still clutched tightly. Outside, I could hear it moving around the cabin, its footsteps, if they could be called that, dragged across the porch, accompanied by a wet, slithering noise that made my skin crawl. And then a knock, soft, slow, deliberate, thud, silence, thud. It wasn't trying to break down the door, it was toying with me. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. The only exit was the front door, and that thing was right on the other side. The windows were too small to climb through, and even if I managed to get out, I didn't know what I'd be running into. Thud. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't going to leave. I scanned the room, desperate for something I could use. The wood stove burned hot, but there was no way I could open it and grab something fast enough. My only option was to make a run for the truck. The keys hung on a hook by the door. I grabbed them, taking a deep breath to steel myself. This was a terrible idea, but staying inside wasn't any better. "Here goes nothing," I muttered, bracing myself. I had no idea what this thing wanted, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. Saying a quick prayer, a habit I'd long abandoned, I yanked the door open. The creature was right there, inches from me, its hollow, lightless eyes locking onto mine. That sickening grin stretched impossibly wide, and for a moment, I froze, fear choking me. The stench of decay hit me like a wave, and I could see now that its pale skin wasn't just ghostly, it was rotting, hanging from its skeletal frame like tattered cloth. My hand tightened on the rifle. I fired point blank, the muzzle flash illuminating its grotesque features. The creature staggered back, a guttural hiss escaping its throat as it retreated into the shadows. The bullet had torn a hole in its chest, but instead of blood, a thick, black ichor oozed from the wound, steaming in the cool night air. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I bolted for the truck, my legs feeling heavy, each step stretching into an eternity. Behind me, that wet, slithering sound grew louder, closer. I threw myself into the driver's seat and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. Come on, I muttered, my voice cracking with desperation. The engine roared to life, its sound a lifeline in the oppressive silence of the forest. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before gripping. The truck lurched forward, and I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. What I saw made my blood run cold. The creature had emerged from the shadows, moving with impossible speed, its limbs contorted unnaturally, bending and stretching in ways that defied the laws of nature. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, locked onto me with a hunger that was horrifyingly human. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine whining as the truck barreled down the narrow dirt road. Trees blurred past, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. The thing was keeping pace, its gangly, distorted frame loping alongside like a monstrous animal. Its rasping breath filled the air, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw its twisted figure drawing closer. Then, with a deafening crack, the windshield shattered. The creature had leapt onto the hood, its hollow eyes peering through the broken glass. Its elongated fingers, tipped with razor-sharp claws, dug into the metal, leaving deep gouges. Its lipless mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth glinting in the moonlight. I swerved violently, trying to shake it off. The truck rocked dangerously, two wheels lifting off the ground as I took a sharp turn to fast. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd lose control, but the wheels slammed back down, and the truck kept moving. The creature clung to the hood like a spider, its face mere inches from mine. I grabbed the rifle from the passenger seat, aimed through the shattered windshield, and fired. The blast tore through its chest, sending it flying off the truck and into the ditch. I didn't stop to check if it was dead. I couldn't. I kept driving, my mind racing, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. It was gone, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that should exist in this world. And that terrified me more than anything else. I drove through the night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustling tree threatening to reveal something worse. When the first rays of dawn broke the horizon, I pulled into the small town of Millbrook, about 60 miles from the cabin. My truck was battered, the windshield shattered, and deep claw marks scored the hood. It drew curious stares from the few early risers on the street. I parked in front of the diner, a place I'd stopped at occasionally on my way to and from the cabin. Stumbling out of the truck, I caught a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. I looked like hell. My clothes were torn, my face pale and hollow, dark circles under my eyes. The bell above the diner door jingled as I entered, and all conversation inside stopped. The patrons turned to stare. Betty, the waitress behind the counter, gasped when she saw me. She was a kind woman in her 50s, and I'd known her for years. "Robert, my God, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, rushing around the counter to guide me to a seat. I opened my mouth to explain, but stopped. Where could I even begin? How could I describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I settled on a half-truth. "Had a bit of trouble up at the cabin," I muttered. "Some kind of animal attack." Her eyes widened. "An animal did that to your truck?" "Must have been one hell of a bear." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. "Could I use your phone?" I asked. "Need to call the sheriff." She pointed me toward the pay phone in the corner. I dialed with trembling fingers, the familiar crackle of the line a strange comfort. Sheriff Tom Hawkins answered on the second ring, his gruff voice steady and reassuring. "Tom, it's Robert Jensen," I said, my voice shaking. "I need your help, Tom. Something happened up at my cabin," I said, my voice trembling. Something in my tone must have tipped him off because Tom's usual casual demeanor disappeared. "Robert, are you all right? Where are you?" "I'm at Betty's Diner in Millbrook," I said. "Tom, I don't know how to explain what happened. You need to see it for yourself. Stay there," he said firmly. "I'm on my way." As I waited, Betty brought me a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of eggs and toast. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the food was in front of me. Mechanically, I ate, my mind spinning as I replayed the events of the night over and over. The other patrons in the diner kept glancing at me, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. About 40 minutes later, Tom's cruiser pulled up beside my battered truck. He stepped out and walked into the diner, his face etched with concern. "Jesus, Robert," he said as he saw me. "You look like you've been through hell." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "That's not far from the truth, Tom." He slid onto the stool next to me and waved off Betty's offer of coffee. "Tell me what happened. Start from the beginning." I took a deep breath and told him everything: the strange noises, the unnatural silence, the creature I had encountered. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift. At first, there was disbelief, but it slowly morphed into concern, then to a kind of guarded fear. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, rubbing a hand over his face. "Robert, I've known you for years. You're not the kind of guy who spins tall tales or lets his imagination run wild. But what you're describing, it's hard to believe." "I know, Tom," I replied. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. But it was real, and it's still out there." Tom leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "Have you heard about the disappearances?" A chill ran down my spine. "Disappearances? Over the past few months, 3 hikers have gone missing in the national forest," he said, his voice grave. "We sent out search parties. Nothing. It's like they vanished into thin air." The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. "You think it's connected to that thing?" He didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we need to find out. We need to go back up there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to stop it." Tom shook his head. "Not yet. You're in no condition to go anywhere. And if what you're saying is true, we're going to need more than just the 2 of us." He was right, of course. Exhaustion had caught up with me, and the adrenaline that had kept me going through the night had worn off, leaving me drained and shaky. "Here's what we'll do," Tom said, his tone taking on the no-nonsense authority he was known for. "You're going to get some rest. I'll put you up at the motel down the street. Meanwhile, I'll make some calls. I've got a friend in the state police who might be able to help. Tomorrow we'll head up to your cabin with backup." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going anywhere, and we'd need to be prepared. Tom drove me to the motel in his cruiser, leaving my truck at the diner for the local mechanic to look over. As he pulled up to the motel, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Robert, I need you to promise me something. Don't talk about this to anyone else. The last thing we need is a panic on our hands, and be careful. Lock your door. If you see or hear anything strange, call me immediately, understand?" "I understand," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "Thanks, Tom." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Get some rest. I'll pick you up first thing in the morning." I watched his cruiser pull away, feeling an uneasy weight settle in my chest. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, it wasn't done with me. The motel clerk gave me a curious look as I checked in, but thankfully didn't ask any questions. My room was small and plain, with faded floral wallpaper and a creaky bed. It wasn't much, but it felt secure. I locked and chained the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Even in the middle of town, miles from the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the old building, Every noise from the parking lot outside made me jump. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with twisted shapes in the darkness, hollow eyes watching me, and that awful, inhuman smile. A sharp knock at the door jolted me awake. For a moment, I was back at the cabin, hearing that deliberate thudding on the porch. Panic gripped me. Then I heard Tom's voice calling my name. I opened the door to find Tom standing there, looking grim. Behind him were two men in state police uniforms. "Robert," Tom said, "this is Sergeant Mike Callahan and Officer Steve Reeves from the state police." The two officers nodded, their expressions a mix of skepticism and concern. I couldn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I wouldn't believe me either. "I'd probably think this was a wild goose chase too," I admitted, trying to steady my voice. Tom gave me a long, measured look. "We're ready to head up to your cabin whenever you are," he said. "Are you sure you're up for this?" I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear twisting in my stomach. "I have to know, Tom. I can't just let this go." The drive back to my cabin was tense. I sat in the back of Tom's cruiser, the state police vehicle following close behind. With every mile, the shadows in the trees seemed deeper, every bend in the road more ominous. By the time we reached Pine Creek, my anxiety had built to a fever pitch. When we pulled into the clearing, everything looked normal at first glance. The cabin stood where I'd left it, the quiet surrounding it almost mocking. But there was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, a wrongness that made my skin crawl. Tom rested a hand on his holstered gun as he spoke. "All right, we'll do a sweep of the area. Robert, you stay close to me. Mike, Steve checked the perimeter." I followed Tom toward the cabin, my breath catching when I saw the porch. The door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze, and deep gouges scarred the wooden planks where the creature had walked. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and my belongings lay scattered where I'd knocked them over during my frantic escape. But the worst part was the marks long, parallel scratches carved into the walls and floor. No animal I'd ever encountered could have made those. What the hell could have done this? Officer Reeves muttered, running his fingers over one of the marks. Before I could respond, Sergeant Callahan's voice called out from the edge of the clearing. "Sheriff, you need to see this." We hurried outside to find Callahan standing just at the tree line. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention. The underbrush was trampled, the trees scarred with more of those strange claw marks. A trail of black, oily substance snaked away into the woods, the same ichor I'd seen oozing from the creature's wounds. "It leads off that way," Callahan said, his voice tight. "Whatever did this, it's big." Tom turned to me, his expression grim. "Robert, I think it's time you told them everything. They need to know what we might be dealing with." So, for the third time, I recounted my terrifying encounter. As I spoke, I saw disbelief flicker in the officers' faces, only to be replaced by grim understanding. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped low in the sky, and long shadows stretched through the trees. "We should head back," Officer Reeves said, glancing nervously at the darkening woods. "Whatever this thing is, I don't want it to be out here after dark." We started to turn back when a sound stopped us cold. "Help, is anyone there? Please, help me." The voice was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. It was coming from deep within the woods. We exchanged uneasy glances. It was a man's voice, desperate and tinged with fear. "We can't ignore that," Tom said, his face set with grim determination. Someone could be in real trouble. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't, not when there was a chance someone needed help, and deep down, I knew I needed answers. We ventured into the forest, the voice guiding us deeper. The trees closed in around us, their skeletal branches blotting out the fading light. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. "Help, over here," the voice called again, closer now. But there was something off about it, a quality I couldn't quite put my finger on. We moved in formation, Tom and I in the center, with Callahan taking point and Reeves covering the rear. Our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just us and that haunting voice. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Reeves muttered. I couldn't have agreed more. Pushing through a dense thicket, we emerged into a small clearing. The voice had stopped. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its bare branches clawing at the darkening sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice echoing eerily. "We're here to help. Where are you?" Silence. Callahan moved toward the tree, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. Suddenly, he stopped, the beam fixed on something at the base of the tree. "Oh, Jesus," he breathed. We rushed to his side, and my stomach lurched at what I saw. Propped against the trunk was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, pale and mottled with decay. His eyes were sunken, lifeless pits, but it was his chest that drew our horrified gaze. It had been torn open, ribs splayed outward like a grotesque flower. The cavity within was empty, hollowed out completely. Reeves stumbled back, his face pale. What could have done this? Before anyone could answer, the voice came again, louder, sharper, and impossibly close. "Help me!" I turned, my blood running cold. The voice hadn't come from the woods this time. It had come from the dead man at the base of the tree. "It's Jim Hawkins," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Jim Hawkins had been missing for 3 weeks. Yet here he was, or what was left of him. As the shock of the gruesome discovery began to settle, another realization struck me. Despite being missing for weeks, the body showed no signs of decay. It looked fresh, as if he'd died only hours ago. Before any of us could comment, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing. We whirled toward the sound, weapons raised. "Who's there?" Callahan barked, his flashlight beam cutting through the tree line. For a long, tense moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice spoke. It was the same voice we had been following, but something had changed. Gone was the fear and desperation. Now, it was cold, mocking, and dripping with malice. "You came," it hissed, the words slow and deliberate. "Just as I knew you would." From the shadows, a figure emerged, and my blood turned to ice. It was the creature from my cabin. Its gaunt, elongated form was unmistakable. But now, under the harsh beam of Callahan's flashlight, I could see details I hadn't noticed before. Its pale, translucent skin pulsed faintly with a bioluminescent glow, and black, oily veins crisscrossed its body like some grotesque network. Its face was a nightmare, a too wide mouth stretched unnaturally across its elongated head, filled with needle-sharp teeth. "What in God's name?" Reeves gasped, his voice trembling. The creature's head snapped toward him, its empty sockets somehow focusing on the young officer. Then it spoke, its voice a rasping, guttural chuckle. "God," it said. "God has no dominion here." In a blur of motion, too fast to follow, the creature lunged at Reeves. His scream was cut short as its claws tore into him, and blood sprayed across the clearing. The rest of us opened fire, the deafening crack of gunshots shattering the silence. Bullets tore into the creature's flesh, spraying black ichor, but it didn't slow down. If anything, it seemed more enraged. It turned from Reeves' lifeless body, its grotesque form twisting and elongating. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, and its movements became more erratic, like a marionette controlled by a sadistic puppeteer. "Run!" Tom shouted, emptying his clip into the monstrosity. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted into the forest, the creature's inhuman laughter echoing behind us. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to grab at my feet, and that horrible wet, slithering sound grew closer with every step. Suddenly, Callahan cried out. I turned to see him fall, his leg caught in a tangle of roots. Tom and I skidded to a stop, rushing back to help him. But as we reached for him, the darkness behind Callahan seemed to move. The creature emerged from the shadows like a living nightmare. Its elongated arms wrapped around Callahan, lifting him off the ground. His scream of terror turned into a wet gurgle as those needle-like teeth sank into his throat. "Tom, we can't help him," I shouted, pulling at his arm. Tom hesitated, but the sight of the creature feasting on Callahan was too much. "We have to go." He yelled, and we ran, the sounds of the creature feeding burning into my memory. We burst out of the tree line near the cabin, gasping for breath. The truck was just ahead, our last hope of escape. But as we neared it, a chilling laugh froze us in our tracks. The creature stood between us and the vehicle. Blood dripped from its maw, and its shifting form seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Did you think you could escape?" It hissed, its voice a symphony of whispers and hisses. "This forest is mine. You are mine." It stepped closer, and I realized with horrifying clarity that this wasn't a mere animal. This was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. We had stumbled into its hunting ground. Tom and I backed against the truck, weapons raised, though we both knew our guns were useless. "What are you?" I found myself asking, my voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. Its terrible grin widened. "I am hunger," it said, its voice like wind rustling through dead leaves. "I am the darkness that lurks in the corners of your world. I am what you fear when you look into the shadows." It took another step forward, its form flickering as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. "For centuries, I slept beneath the earth, forgotten by your kind. But now I am awake, and I am hungry." Tom's hand gripped my arm tightly. "Robert," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "when I say run, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." "No, Tom," I started to protest, realizing what he was planning. But before I could finish, he charged. Tom tackled the creature, his shouts of defiance mixing with its guttural screeches. They tumbled to the ground in a chaotic tangle of limbs. "Run!" he shouted, struggling to pin the writhing nightmare. Every instinct screamed at me to help him, but I knew it would be suicide. Choking back a sob, I turned and ran, tears streaming down my face. Behind me, I could hear Tom's shouts and the creature's sickening laughter. Then came the sound of flesh tearing, and Tom's voice fell silent. I ran blindly through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get as far away as possible. Tom was gone, and I was alone. I had no plan, no thought beyond the primal need to get away. The forest seemed alive, closing in around me, its shadows reaching out like claws. I don't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. Time lost meaning in the oppressive darkness. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. As I sat there, trembling, I realized I recognized my surroundings. Somehow, in my blind panic, I had run in a circle. I was back near the cabin, not far from where I had left Tom. Guilt and fear warred within me. I couldn't just leave Tom behind, not if there was even a chance he was alive. But going back meant facing that thing again. Could I do it? Did I have the courage? As I wrestled with my thoughts, a sound broke through the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew clearer, a haunting, otherworldly melody, singing. The song was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with eerie beauty. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself drawn toward it. I crept through the trees, moving as quietly as I could. As I approached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that froze my blood. The creature stood in the center of the clearing, its grotesque form now more humanoid than before. In its elongated arms, it cradled Tom's limp body, and it was singing. The melody was alien, the words shifting and twisting as though defying comprehension. Yet the effect was undeniable. As I watched, horrified, Tom's body began to change. His skin turned pale and translucent, his limbs elongating and twisting unnaturally. His chest cavity opened with a sickening crack, ribs splaying outward like grotesque petals. Tendrils of black, oily substance flowed from the creature and into Tom's body. Dawning horror gripped me as I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just killing. This was transformation. This was reproduction. Tom's eyes snapped open, but they weren't his anymore. They were hollow, empty sockets, just like the creatures. A scream built in my throat, threatening to burst out, but I clamped a hand over my mouth, biting down hard enough to taste blood. I couldn't let them know I was there. I couldn't end up like Tom. The creature's song swelled to a crescendo, and with one final, horrific twist, the transformation was complete. Where Tom had been, there now stood another creature smaller, newer, but no less monstrous. The original creature turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto mine in the darkness, its terrible grin stretched wider. "Welcome, little one," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "The forest has been lonely, but now we will never be alone again." The two creatures began to advance, and I knew this was the end. This was how it happened to those missing hikers. This was how it would happen to me. But then, a new sound broke through the night, a sound that didn't belong in the forest. Sirens. The wailing of approaching sirens seemed to confuse the creatures. They paused, their elongated heads tilting in unison, as if listening. It was the opening I needed. I turned and ran, every muscle screaming in protest. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, the sound of the sirens pulling me like a lifeline. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their wet, slithering movements closing in. Bursting through the tree line, I stumbled onto the dirt road, illuminated by flashing blue and red lights. A convoy of police vehicles was speeding toward me. I waved my arms frantically, collapsing onto the road as the lead car skidded to a stop. Deputy Sarah Collins jumped out, her eyes wide with shock as she took in my battered appearance. "Robert, what in God's name?" Her question was cut short by a blood-curdling shriek from the woods. I turned to see the creatures emerge from the shadows, their forms rippling and shifting grotesquely in the headlights. "Open fire," Sarah yelled, drawing her weapon. The night erupted in gunfire as the officers unloaded round after round into the advancing creatures. But as before, the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creatures moved with jerky, unnatural speed, closing the distance in moments. The smaller creature, the one that had been Tom, lunged at an officer, its claws tearing through his vest like paper. Blood sprayed across the side of a cruiser as the officer's scream was abruptly silenced. Chaos erupted. Officers shouted orders, their voices tinged with panic, as the creatures tore through their ranks. These were men and women who had faced armed criminals, who had seen humanity at its worst. But nothing could have prepared them for this. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with determination. "We need to go, now," she yelled over the cacophony. She dragged me to her cruiser, shoving me into the passenger seat before jumping in herself. The engine roared as she threw the car into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As we sped away, I caught a glimpse of the carnage in the rearview mirror. The creatures were methodical, ripping through the officers like wolves in a sheep pen. Tears blurred my vision as the sounds of gunfire and screams faded behind us. I had no idea how we were going to stop these things. I only knew that we had to try. Their inhuman strength and speed were far beyond what we were prepared to face. As Sarah floored the accelerator, gravel sprayed behind us, and we sped away from the carnage. In the side mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creatures. They stood motionless, watching us leave, making no move to pursue. They didn't need to, they had claimed this territory. As the truck tore down the winding mountain road, Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I stared out at the passing trees, my mind a whirlwind of horror and grief. "Robert," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute, "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning." So, once again, I recounted the nightmare. I told her about the noises in the woods, the creature at my cabin, the ill-fated expedition, and Tom's sacrifice. Her face hardened as I spoke, grief and anger battling in her eyes. When I finished, the silence in the truck was suffocating. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. The weight of all we had seen and lost pressed down on me like a shroud. "We can't let this stand," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, steady, and filled with resolve. "Whatever those things are, they killed our people. They killed Tom. We're going to stop them." I nodded, grim determination replacing my fear. She was right. We couldn't run away and pretend this hadn't happened. Those creatures were still out there, still hunting, and they wouldn't stop. As we approached the edge of town, emergency vehicles raced past us in the opposite direction, heading toward the mountain. My stomach twisted. They didn't know what they were driving into. No amount of conventional firepower could stop those things. "We need help," I said, my voice hoarse. "Professional help. People who deal with things that aren't supposed to exist." Sarah glanced at me, understanding dawning in her expression. "I've heard rumors," she said cautiously, "about government agencies that handle unusual cases, supernatural cases. I always thought they were just stories, but after what we've seen..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. We pulled into the sheriff's station just as the first rays of dawn lit the sky. I stepped out of the truck, the exhaustion and trauma of the night weighing me down. The world around me felt different, changed. Sarah wasted no time. She began making calls, reaching out to contacts, and calling in every favor she could. I stood by the window, staring out toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods, those creatures were waiting, watching, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. A cabin in the snow. I thought I was going to have a quiet winter. The kind that let me disappear from the world for a while. Just me and my wife, Megan, in our small cabin near the edge of Bridger Teton National Forest in Wyoming. We had bought the cabin years ago, a retreat from the chaos of my job as a park ranger. Tucked deep into the woods, it was so remote you had to navigate a narrow, overgrown trail just to reach it. There was no cell service, and in the winter, the landline often went down during storms. That isolation was exactly what I wanted. The cabin wasn't fancy, to small rooms, a wood stove that kept the chill at bay, and a pantry stocked with enough supplies to last us until the spring thaw. Life was simple there. Megan and I spent our evenings playing cards or reading by candlelight. Occasionally, I would patrol the area, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. It was a life that suited me after years of dealing with tourists and hikers. Megan was my rock during those years, always level-headed and prepared. She had been through tough times before, but nothing could have prepared either of us for what was coming. As December settled in, the days grew shorter, and the nights stretched long. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees groaning under the weight of snow and ice. I found myself staring out the window more often, watching the shadows play across the white landscape. Sometimes I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Megan noticed my unease. "You're jumpier than usual, Tom," she said one evening as we sat by the fire. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Just the winter getting to me," I said. "You know how I get when I'm cooped up too long." She nodded, but gave me a concerned look. Megan knew me better than anyone. She could tell when something was off. But how could I explain the dread that had been building inside me? How could I tell her about the whispers I thought I heard on the wind or the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord? I couldn't, so I kept it to myself, hoping the feeling would pass. But as the days wore on, the sensation only grew stronger. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and on a cold December night, the nightmare began. It finally made its presence known on a night so cold my breath hung in the air like a ghost. Megan had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache, while I stayed up tending the fire, debating whether to let it burn down or add another log. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows and seeping through the cracks, sending icy drafts skittering across the floor. Then I heard it, a knock, just one, firm and deliberate. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. We didn't get visitors out here. No one knew we were here except for a few people back in town, and even they rarely bothered us. My first thought was that it might have been an animal brushing against the cabin. Elk sometimes wandered close, and once, we'd even had a bear sniffing around. But that knock, it wasn't random, it was too deliberate, too human. I reached for my rifle, always kept nearby for bears, and cracked the door open a sliver. Bitter wind rushed in, carrying a flurry of snowflakes, and a scent I couldn't quite place, earthy and musty, like wet leaves and decay. There was no one there. I stepped outside, leaving the door ajar behind me, and scanned the clearing. The cold bit through my jacket as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. A set of footprints trailed away from the cabin, fresh in the thin layer of snow. They led into the woods, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. I wasn't about to go chasing after some stranger in the dark. The forest could be treacherous, and I didn't know who or what I was dealing with. But the idea of someone wandering so close to the cabin without announcing themselves felt wrong. I went back inside, shut the door tight, and locked it. The rifle stayed by my side for the rest of the night. Megan stirred a few times, but I didn't wake her. No sense in worrying her over something that could have been nothing. Still, as I sat there in the flickering firelight, my eyes fixed on the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something had found us in our isolation, and it was only a matter of time before it made itself known again. By morning, the footprints were gone, buried under fresh snow. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost, 2 nights later, just after sunset, it happened again. This time, the knock was softer, almost hesitant, as if whoever or whatever was out there was testing us. I grabbed the rifle, told Megan to stay in the bedroom, and opened the door wide. I saw him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, bundled in a thick coat and hat. At first glance, he could have been any lost hiker, but even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. His posture was too stiff, and he stood too still, like he was waiting for something. "Hey," I called out. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" He didn't answer, didn't move. I stepped forward, the rifle in my hands, but not pointed at him. I'd dealt with plenty of lost hikers before, and most of them were desperate to be found. This man didn't act like that. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. "Do you need help?" I called again. Still no response. I stopped halfway across the yard, unsure of what to do. If he was lost, I needed to get him inside. Night was falling, and it was too cold for anyone to survive out here for long. But everything about the situation screamed danger. Then he took a step forward. Just one. Slow, deliberate. I raised the rifle. "Don't come any closer," I warned. He stopped, but the silence between us hung heavy and oppressive. "You're not from around here, are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "We don't get many people this far out." Still nothing. My mind raced. This man wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for help. He was here for a reason, and I had no idea what that reason was. I took a step back toward the cabin, my eyes never leaving him. As soon as I moved, he did too, one slow, deliberate step forward, mirroring me. "You're not welcome here," I said, my voice firm. He responded with another step forward. I knew I couldn't let him get any closer. My fingers tensed around the rifle. I didn't want to shoot, but I wasn't about to let this stranger near Megan. I didn't know what he was capable of, but everything about him felt wrong. The way he moved, the way he stood, the way he seemed to know exactly how far he could push me. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, sighting him in. "This is your last chance," I called. "Go back the way you came, or I'll make you." He stopped. For a moment, I thought he might actually leave. But then he smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was slow and deliberate, stretching across his face like he'd been waiting for this moment. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, heart pounding, rifle still raised, as the eerie silence of the forest swallowed me. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet, as if holding their breath. When I finally lowered the rifle, my arms were trembling. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Megan was waiting, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she asked. "Who was out there?" I shook my head, struggling to find the words. How could I explain the unnatural stillness of the man? The way his smile had seemed to split his face? How could I convey the bone-deep certainty that whatever had been standing out there wasn't entirely human? It finally revealed itself on a night so cold that my breath lingered in the air like a ghost. Megan had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache, while I stayed up tending the fire, unsure whether to let it burn low or add another log. Outside, the wind howled, as though a wounded animal was calling out, rattling the windows and seeping through the cracks, sending icy drafts skittering across the floor. Then I heard it, a knock, one, firm and purposeful. At first, I thought I imagined it. Visitors were rare out here, no one knew we were here except a few folks back in town, and they hardly ever bothered us. My first thought was that an animal had brushed against the cabin. Elk wandered close sometimes, and once, we had even had a bear sniffing around. But that knock, it wasn't random, it was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my rifle, always kept close for situations like this, and cracked open the door just a sliver. Bitter wind rushed in, carrying a flurry of snowflakes and an unfamiliar scent, earthy, musty, like wet leaves or decay. But there was no one there. I stepped outside, leaving the door ajar, and scanned the clearing. The cold pierced through my jacket as my eyes adjusted to the dark. Fresh footprints trailed away from the cabin in the thin snow, leading into the woods, vanishing into the shadows between the trees. I wasn't about to go chasing some stranger in the dark. The forest was treacherous, and I had no idea who or what I was dealing with. But the idea of someone wandering so close to the cabin without a word didn't sit right with me. I went back inside, shut the door, and locked it. The rifle stayed by my side for the rest of the night. Megan stirred a few times, but I didn't wake her. No sense in worrying her over something that could have been nothing. Still, as I sat there in the flickering firelight, my eyes fixed on the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something had found us in our isolation, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself again. By morning, the footprints had vanished, buried under fresh snow. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Almost, 2 nights later, just after sunset, it happened again. This time, the knock was softer, almost hesitant, as if whoever or whatever was out there was testing us. I grabbed the rifle, told Megan to stay in the bedroom, and opened the door wide. And there he was. He stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, bundled in a thick coat and hat. At first glance, he could have been any lost hiker, but even from a distance, something felt off. His posture was too rigid, and he stood unnervingly still, as if waiting for something. "Hey," I called out. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" He didn't respond, didn't move. I stepped forward, rifle in hand, but not aimed at him. I'd dealt with lost hikers before, and most of them were eager for help. This man didn't seem to be. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes too hard to make out in the fading light. "Do you need help?" I called again. No answer. I stopped halfway across the yard, unsure of what to do. If he was lost, I needed to get him inside. Night was falling, and the cold would be too much for anyone to survive out here. But everything about the situation screamed danger. Then he moved. Just one step, slow, deliberate. I raised the rifle. "Don't come any closer," I warned. He stopped, but the silence between us felt heavy, almost suffocating. "You're not from around here, are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We don't get many people this far out." Still, no response. My mind raced. This man wasn't lost. He wasn't asking for help. He was here for a reason, and I had no idea what that reason was. I took a step back toward the cabin, keeping my eyes locked on him. As soon as I moved, he did, to one slow, deliberate step forward, mirroring me. "You're not welcome here," I said, my voice firm. He took another step forward. I couldn't let him get any closer. My fingers tightened around the rifle. I didn't want to shoot, but I wouldn't let this stranger near Megan. I didn't know what he was capable of. but everything about him felt wrong. The way he moved, the way he stood, the way he seemed to know exactly how far he could push me. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, taking aim. "This is your last chance," I called. "Go back the way you came, or I'll make you." He stopped. For a moment, I thought he might actually leave. But then he smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was slow, deliberate, stretching across his face like he'd been waiting for this moment. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the forest's darkness. I stood there, heart pounding, rifle still raised, as the eerie silence of the woods closed in around me. The forest had gone unnervingly quiet, as if it were holding its breath. When I finally lowered the rifle, my arms were shaking. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Megan was waiting, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she asked. "Who was out there?" I shook my head, struggling to find the words. How could I explain the unnatural stillness of the man, the way his smile had split his face? How could I convey the bone-deep certainty that whatever had stood out there wasn't entirely human? It wasn't safe. We dressed in our warmest clothes, layering up against the bitter cold we knew awaited us outside. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and handed Megan the only other weapon we had, a heavy hunting knife. Just as we were about to open the door, a knock came, 3 sharp raps, so loud they seemed to shake the entire cabin. Megan and I froze, staring at each other in horror. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice, a deep, sonorous tone with an accent I couldn't place. "I know you're in there," it said. "I've been waiting so long. Won't you invite me in?" Megan's face went pale. Her eyes widened in recognition. "It's him," she whispered. "The man from the woods." I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. "We're armed," I called out. "Leave now, or I'll shoot." A chuckle came from the other side, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Oh, I don't think you will," the voice said. "After all, is that any way to treat an old friend?" And then, to my horror, I heard the sound of the lock turning. The door began to open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the blinding white of the snow outside. "No," I heard Megan whisper beside me. "No, no, no." The figure stepped inside, and I felt my world tilt on its axis. The face that smiled at us was all too familiar yet horribly wrong. It was my own. The thing wearing my face stood in the doorway, snow swirling around it, that terrible smile still fixed in place. It was like looking into a warped mirror. Everything was almost right, but just wrong enough to send a shiver down my spine. Its eyes were too bright, the smile too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. "What's the matter?" it asked, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "Don't you recognize yourself?" I raised the rifle, my hand shaking. "You're not me," I growled. "What are you?" It laughed, a sound that reverberated through the cabin. "I'm you, of course," it said. "The you that could be. The you that will be, once you let go of all those pesky human limitations." Beside me, Megan whimpered. I glanced at her and saw her eyes darting between me and the thing in the doorway, confusion and terror warring on her face. "Don't listen to it, Megan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's trying to trick us." The creature took a step forward, and I tightened my finger on the trigger. "Stay back," I warned. It cocked its head to the side, that unnatural smile never wavering. "Or what?" it asked. "You'll shoot yourself." "Come now, we both know you're not capable of that. You're too moral." It spat the last word like it was distasteful. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to buy time to think of a way out of this nightmare. "What everyone wants," it replied, spreading its arms wide. "To live, to grow, to become more than what I am. And you, my friend, are the key to that." It took another step forward. This time I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the cabin. I saw the bullet hit, saw a spray of dark liquid that might have been blood, but the creature didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, the hole in its chest began to close, the flesh knitting itself back together before my eyes. "Now, that wasn't very nice," it chuckled, still using my voice. "I think it's time we stopped playing games, don't you?" Suddenly, it moved faster than anything human had a right to. Before I could react, it was on me, knocking the rifle from my hands and pinning me against the wall. Its strength was incredible and human. I struggled, but it was like fighting against a force of nature. "Get off him!" Megan screamed, and I saw her lunge forward with the hunting knife. The blade sank deep into the creature's back, but it barely seemed to notice. With its free hand, it backhanded Megan, sending her flying across the room, where she crumpled against the far wall. "Megan," I cried out, redoubling my efforts to break free, but the creature held me fast. Its face was inches from mine. This close, I could see the subtle wrongness of its features even more clearly. The skin was too smooth, almost waxy, and there was something moving beneath it, as if its bones were rearranging themselves. "You've been so alone out here," it said, its voice almost gentle now. "So isolated. Did you really think nothing would notice? Nothing would come to claim this little pocket of humanity you've carved out in the wilderness?" Its hand moved to my face, fingers icy cold against my skin. "But don't worry," it continued. "Soon you won't be alone anymore. Soon you'll be part of something greater. Part of us." I felt something begin to seep from its fingers, a cold that went beyond temperature, seeping into my skin, my muscles, my very bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world began to blur around the edges, darkness creeping in. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was Megan stirring weakly on the other side of the room. Behind her, more shapes moved in the open doorway. More faces, my face repeated over and over, all wearing that same terrible smile. Then, mercifully, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the darkness that enveloped me. It was a strange state, not quite unconsciousness, but far from awake. I floated in a void, aware of my own thoughts, but unable to move, to speak, to do anything but exist in this liminal space. And I wasn't a lone dot in the darkness. I sensed presences, entities, vast and ancient. Their consciousness was so alien that merely brushing against it threatened to shatter my sanity. They didn't communicate with words, but with concepts, feelings that crashed over me like tidal waves. They showed me visions of a world beyond my understanding, forests that breathed, mountains that dreamed, spaces between spaces where reality folded in on itself, and the laws of physics were mere suggestions. Through it all, there was a hunger, a desperate, all-consuming need to expand, to grow, to become more. I saw myself, or rather, the thing that had taken my form, moving through the woods, but it wasn't alone anymore. There were dozens of them now, all wearing my face, all smiling that terrible smile. They moved with purpose, spreading out from our cabin like a virus, and I understood then what they were, what they wanted. They were an infection consciousness from somewhere beyond our reality that had found a way in, using the isolation and the endless wilderness as a foothold. And now, they were spreading, copying themselves, using my image as a template to create more and more of themselves. I tried to recoil from this knowledge, to retreat further into the darkness of my own mind, but they wouldn't let me. They held me there, forcing me to watch as they moved through the forest, finding other isolated cabins, other people who thought they were alone in the wilderness. I saw them take more forms, copying not just me now, but others. Men, women, children, each one assimilated, their essence absorbed and replicated. An army of doppelgangers, all part of the same vast alien intelligence. Through it all, one thought burned in my mind: Megan. Where was she? Had they taken her to? I fought against the smothering darkness, tried to call out to her, to find some trace of her in this psychic maelstrom. And then, faintly, I felt something, a warmth in the cold void, a light in the darkness. Megan's presence, dim but undeniably there. She was alive, still herself, not yet taken by the entities that had consumed me. With that realization came a surge of hope, and with hope, strength. I focused on that warmth, that light, using it as an anchor to pull myself back from the brink. Slowly, agonizingly, I began to claw my way back to consciousness. The entities fought me, tried to drag me back into the void, but I had something to fight for now, someone to protect. With one final Herculean effort, I broke free of their grasp and surged back to awareness. I opened my eyes with a gasp, finding myself back in the cabin, but everything had changed. The cabin was in ruins. The walls were covered in a strange, pulsating growth that seemed to breathe in time with some unheard rhythm. The air was thick with a musty, organic smell that made my stomach churn. Everywhere I looked, I saw faces. My face repeated over and over, emerging from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I was lying on the floor, my body feeling strange and distant, as if I wasn't quite connected to it anymore. As I pushed myself up, I noticed my hands. They looked normal at first glance, but as I watched, the skin seemed to ripple, as if something was moving beneath the surface. "Oh God," I whispered, the horror of my situation crashing down on me. I wasn't free. I had merely regained some semblance of control, but the infection was still there, still trying to consume me. A noise from across the room caught my attention. There, huddled in a corner, was Megan. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she was alive. And more importantly, she was still herself, Megan. I called out, my voice rough and unfamiliar to my own ears. She looked up, hope and fear warring on her face. "Tom, is it really you?" I nodded, then hesitated. "I think so, mostly. But Megan, you need to stay back. I don't know how much control I have." She stood shakily, keeping her distance, but not taking her eyes off me. "What happened? What are these things?" I shook my head, struggling to find the words to explain the horrors I'd witnessed in the void. "They're not from here, not from anywhere we understand. They're trying to spread, to take over, and they're using us to do it." As if in response to my words, the faces in the walls began to move, turning to look at us with hungry eyes. I felt a pressure building in my mind, the entities trying to reassert control. "We have to get out of here," I said, gritting my teeth against the invasion. "We have to warn people." Megan nodded, her face setting in determination. "How?" "They're everywhere," I said, looking around the ruined cabin, searching for anything that might help us. My eyes fell on the wood stove, still burning despite everything that had happened, and suddenly, I knew what we had to do. "Fire," I said. "They don't like fire." I could feel it when they were in my mind. "It's one of the few things ... double quotes through the trees at night, sounds that no animal could produce." Most of it I dismissed as local folklore, the kind of tales people tell to explain the unexplained. But deep down, something in me always felt unsettled. Maybe it was the silence that could stretch for miles, or the way the wind would shift in the forest, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets. Whatever it was, it tugged at me, like a distant echo of something I couldn't quite understand. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I felt it. That same cold chill that gripped my bones, that gnawing sense of being watched. I stood at the edge of the clearing, the setting sun casting long shadows over the woods, and for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anything, but I knew something was there, in the trees, just beyond the edge of my perception. That night, as I sat by the fire in my cabin, I heard the knock, 3 sharp raps that shattered the stillness of the evening. My heart skipped a beat, my senses on high alert. It was a sound too deliberate to be an accident. I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Bears were common in these parts, but that wasn't it. This was different. I grabbed my rifle, just as I had done countless times before, and cautiously approached the door. Another knock came, louder this time, echoing through the cabin like the toll of a distant bell. My grip tightened on the rifle. I swung the door open, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing, no one. Just the dense forest stretching out before me, the twilight turning everything to shades of gray and black. But as my eyes scanned the shadows, I saw it, footprints in the snow leading toward the woods, fresh and deep. Whoever or whatever had been out there was no longer visible. My mind raced, but there was nothing I could do. I couldn't go after them into the woods, not in the dark. Instead, I bolted the door and sat by the fire, rifle still in hand, waiting for the night to pass. The next morning, I found the same tracks leading away from the cabin, They were unmistakable. Someone had been here, but I was no closer to understanding who or what was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again as I traced the footprints, but there was nothing I could do. Days passed, and I tried to put it out of my mind. The wilderness had a way of making you think things were strange, but that didn't explain the feeling of something watching me from the shadows. Then came the second knock. This time, I wasn't alone. I had Megan with me, and the knock was followed by a voice deep and resonant. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I heard it in my bones, felt it in the core of my being. It said it had been waiting for so long. The door opened, and the thing, it, stood there, wearing my face, that same awful smile stretched across its lips. It spoke in my voice, echoing everything I had ever known, twisting it into something unrecognizable. I raised the rifle, but it didn't flinch. It didn't even move when I fired. It only laughed, that sound scraping against my mind. The wound healed instantly. I felt its power, its presence, crawling into my thoughts, as if it was me. It wasn't just one. It was a virus, an infection, a consciousness seeking to spread itself across every living thing. It had found me. It had found Megan. We fought, but not with just guns or knives. We fought with fire, the only thing that could push them back, the only thing they feared. We set the cabin ablaze, the flames licking at the walls, consuming the faces that stared back at us. We didn't stop there. We kept moving, through the woods, setting fire to everything that seemed wrong, everything that wasn't real. Each fire weakened their hold on us, but we knew it wasn't enough. They were still out there, still spreading, still copying. And as we trudged through the snow, leaving behind the ruins of our home, I knew the real battle was only just beginning. We would warn others. We would fight them. We would do whatever it took to stop this infection from consuming everything we knew and loved. Through the fire, through the cold, through the nightmarish creatures hunting us, we fought. Together, with Megan by my side, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Through the valleys. On moonless nights, through the valleys of the park, most rangers dismissed the stories of Cold Hollow as nothing more than local folklore wild tales that flourished in remote areas, where imagination could run unchecked. But having spent enough time in these mountains, I knew better. Sometimes, even the wildest stories had a kernel of truth hidden beneath them. It was late September when everything changed. The days had shortened, and the crisp bite in the air hinted at the winter to come. I had just finished my morning coffee when the radio crackled to life, shattering the peaceful silence of the cabin. "Ranger Hawthorne, come in, over." I recognized Maggie Reeves' voice, the dispatch operator from park headquarters. Normally all business, but there was an edge to her voice that put me on alert. "This is Hawthorne, go ahead." There was a pause, long enough to make my heart race. When Maggie's voice came back, it was lower, almost conspiratorial. "Sam, we've got a situation. I need you to check out some reports we've been getting from the Cold Hollow area." A chill ran down my spine. That had nothing to do with the autumn air. Cold Hollow was a place even the most seasoned rangers spoke of only in hushed tones. Officially off limits due to its treacherous terrain, the valley was the source of many local stories. Unofficially, it was where the strange and unexplained occurred. "What kind of reports?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The usual at first," Maggie replied. "Strange lights, weird noises. But last night we got a call from old man Grom. Says he saw something out there, something that scared him bad enough that he won't leave his house." I knew Grom. He was one of the toughest old coots who'd lived on the edge of the park for decades. It'd take more than a coyote or a bear to spook him. "What did he see?" I asked. Another pause. He wouldn't say exactly. Just kept muttering about them and how they were coming out of the woods. "Sam," he sounded terrified. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden racing of my heart. "All right, Maggie, I'll check it out. But I'm going to need backup on this one." "Negative," she responded quickly. "Everyone else is tied up with the search and rescue operation on the other side of the park. You're the only one available." I wanted to argue, to insist that someone else be sent, but I knew it was pointless. If something was happening in Cold Hollow, it needed to be investigated now, not days from now when backup could be mobilized. Understood, I said. Finally, I'll head out there now, but Maggie, if you don't hear from me by nightfall, send someone to come looking. Will do, Sam, and be careful out there. The radio went silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts, which were quickly clouded by a growing unease. I'd investigated plenty of strange reports over the years, but something about this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something far beyond my understanding. I gathered my gear, checked my sidearm, and locked up the cabin. As I set out toward Cold Hollow, I had no idea that this would be the beginning of something that would change my life forever. The trail to Cold Hollow was barely more than an overgrown game path, winding through some of the most rugged terrain in the park, a testament to why this area was off limits. The deeper I ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to press in on all sides, their branches interlacing overhead, blocking out most of the light. The air grew colder as I descended into the valley, and an eerie stillness settled over the woods. The usual sounds of birds and rustling animals in the underbrush faded away until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own labored breathing. 3 hours into the hike, I came across the first sign that something was wrong. It was simple at first, a deer carcass lying just off the trail, but it wasn't the carcass that caught my attention. It was the way it had been arranged. The legs were splayed at unnatural angles, its ribcage pried open, the bones gleaming white in the dim light filtering through the canopy. But what made my stomach lurch was the strange symbols carved into the flesh. Crude, angular shapes that looked like no language I had ever seen before. A cold sense of dread washed over me. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew, nor the work of any hiker or camper. This was something else entirely. Forcing myself to look away, I continued down the trail, my hand never straying far from the holster at my hip. The deeper I went into Cold Hollow, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and it carried a faint, sickly sweet odor that I couldn't quite place. It was late afternoon when I reached the heart of the valley. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and at the center stood an old cabin. It wasn't on any of our maps, which meant it likely predated the establishment of the park itself. The cabin was in a state of advanced decay. Its roof had partially collapsed, and vines crawled up its walls, as if nature was trying to reclaim it. But there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It took me a moment to realize what it was. There were no sounds of animals or insects around the structure. It was as if every living thing was keeping its distance from this place. It was as if every living thing was giving the cabin a wide berth. As I approached, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I froze, hand instinctively going to my sidearm. For a moment, I thought I saw a face peering out at me from one of the broken windows, pale, gaunt, its eyes glowing faintly in the dimness. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "This is Ranger Hawthorne. Is anyone there?" No response came from the cabin, but as my words echoed through the clearing, something else emerged. A faint whispering, coming from the woods around me. I couldn't make out any words, but the sound sent an icy chill down my spine. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to approach the cabin. The porch creaked ominously under my weight as I made my way to the door, which hung askew on its hinges. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a scene of chaos. Furniture lay overturned and smashed. The walls were covered with more of those strange symbols I'd seen on the deer carcass earlier, but now they were painted in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My gaze dropped to the center of the room, and a wave of nausea hit me. A circle had been cleared in the debris. At its center lay a collection of objects, animal bones, feathers, strange carved stones, and at the center of it all, a human skull. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some vagrant camp or the hideout of a local cult. This was something far worse, something deeply unsettling. As I turned to leave, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Without thinking, I picked it up and stuffed it into my pack. Whatever was going on here, that book might hold some answers. I was so focused on getting out of the cabin that I almost missed it, a sound so faint I thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, a child's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. I froze, heart pounding, a sickening realization settling over me. Whatever was happening in Cold Hollow, it was far beyond my ability to handle alone. I needed to get back to my cabin, to call for backup, and report what I had found. But as I stepped out of the cabin and into the clearing, I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. Things had changed. The sun, which should have still been high in the sky, was nowhere to be seen. An unnatural darkness had fallen over the valley, heavy and suffocating. In that darkness, I heard movement. A lot of movement. They were out there, watching me, and somehow, I knew they weren't going to let me leave Cold Hollow without a fight. The darkness that had descended on Cold Hollow was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt alive, pulsing, shifting around me, as if it were closing in, suffocating the space around me. The beam of my flashlight seemed weak and ineffective against it, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. I kept moving, each step more cautious than the last, my senses on high alert. The whispering I had heard earlier had grown louder, more constant, like a chorus rising from everywhere and nowhere at once. Occasionally, I caught a word or a phrase, "Join us," "Stay forever," "One of us." Each phrase sent a new wave of terror through me. I had been walking for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it had only been minutes, when I saw a figure standing motionless on the trail ahead. The flashlight beam caught it for a brief moment, illuminating a gaunt face with sunken eyes, skin so pale it was almost translucent. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. It just took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. As it moved, I caught a glimpse of something in its hand, something long and wicked looking. A knife, its blade dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. I took a step back, my hand moving to my sidearm. "Stay where you are," I shouted. "I'm a park ranger." "Put down the knife and we can talk about this." The figure paused, and for a split second, I thought it might listen. But then, without warning, it lunged at me with inhuman speed. I barely had time to draw my weapon before it was upon me, the knife slashing through the air where my throat had been just a split second before. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping the sound would scare it off, but the figure didn't flinch. It came at me again, its face twisted into a grin more terrifying than any snarl I had ever seen. In that moment, all my training, all my experience, seemed to evaporate. I was no longer a seasoned park ranger. I was prey, and I was being hunted by something that defied understanding. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, heedless of the trail or my own safety. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I barely felt them. All I knew was that I had to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear it behind me, its footsteps unnaturally quiet, but I could feel its presence closing in on me with each passing second. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into another clearing. In the center stood another cabin, similar to the one I had found earlier. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, praying its walls would provide some protection against whatever was chasing me. I slammed the door behind me, fumbling with the lock. For a moment, there was silence. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, struggling to catch my breath. Had I lost it? Was I safe? Then I heard it, a soft scratching at the door, gentle at first, then growing more insistent. My eyes darted around the cabin, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but the feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. The scratching stopped, replaced by a voice raspy, familiar, yet chilling. "Let us in, Ranger," it whispered, the tone almost playful, as though it enjoyed the fear it stirred. "We only wanted to play." I remained silent, hoping, praying that if I didn't respond, it would go away. But then other voices joined the first, a chorus of whispers that seemed to surround the cabin, coming from all directions. "Join us," they urged. "Become one with the hollow. It's so lonely here. We need new friends." The voices grew louder, more insistent, pushing against my resolve like a rising tide. I could hear movement now, footsteps on the porch, scraping sounds at the windows, the creak of something heavy on the roof. I was trapped, surrounded by things I couldn't even begin to understand. As the night wore on, the assault on the cabin continued. The scratching, the whispering, the inhuman sounds from outside, they all blended into a cacophony of terror that threatened to drive me mad. I huddled in a corner, my service weapon clutched tightly in my trembling hands, jumping at every groan of the old structure. It felt as if the cabin itself was alive, groaning under the weight of something unseen. During a rare moment of relative quiet, I remembered the book I had taken from the other cabin. With shaking hands, I pulled it from my pack. If I was going to die here, I at least wanted to understand why. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and peeling. As I opened it, a musty odor filled the air, accompanied by a faint metallic scent of old blood. The pages were filled with handwritten text, the script spidery and difficult to read in the dim light of my flashlight. A chill ran down my spine as I began to read. The journal was dated back to the early 1800s, and it told a story so horrifying, so unbelievable, that at first I thought it must be some kind of twisted fiction. But as I read on, I began to realize that every word of it was true. The journal belonged to a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, one of the first settlers in this part of the mountains. He wrote about how he and his family had come to this valley, seeking a new life, drawn by rumors of fertile land and abundant game. But what they found instead was something ancient, an evil something that had been waiting in these woods long before humans ever set foot here. Blackwood wrote about strange symbols carved into the trees, eerie lights that danced through the forest at night, and whispers that seemed to come from the very earth itself. At first, they tried to ignore these things, focusing on building their homestead and surviving in the harsh wilderness. But then, people started to disappear. It began with livestock, a cow here, a few chickens there, but soon, it was people. First, a young boy wandered into the woods and never returned. Then, a woman vanished while hanging laundry just steps from her cabin. The settlers searched, but found no trace of the missing. My blood ran cold as I read on. Blackwood described how, driven by desperation and fear, he had ventured deep into the woods seeking answers. What he found there defied comprehension. He wrote of an ancient stone circle hidden in a valley that seemed to exist outside of time. Within that circle, he encountered beings that he struggled to describe, entities that seemed to shift between human and animal, between solid and shadow. These beings, Blackwood learned, had inhabited the land for millennia. They weren't evil, exactly, but utterly alien. Their motivations and desires were incomprehensible to human minds. They had been drawn to the settlers, curious about these new creatures in their domain, but that curiosity was fatal to humans. The most chilling part of Blackwood's account was his description of what happened to those taken by the entities. They weren't killed, not in any way we would understand. Instead, they were changed, transformed into something no longer fully human. Their minds and bodies altered to become more like the entities themselves. As I neared the end of the journal, my hands shook so badly I could barely turn the pages. Blackwood's writing became more frantic, his words scrawled across the paper in a desperate frenzy. He wrote of how the entities had begun to call to him, promising him knowledge and power beyond his wildest dreams, if he would just give himself over to them. The final entry chilled me to my core. In shaky handwriting, Blackwood had written, "I can resist no longer. They are coming for me, and I find I no longer wish to run. I go now to join them, to become one with the forest and the darkness. May God have mercy on my soul." As I closed the book, a horrible realization dawned on me. The figure I had encountered on the trail, the voices calling to me from the woods, these were not just random spirits or malevolent entities. They were people. People who had been taken by whatever dwelled in Cold Hollow, transformed into something no longer human. And now, they wanted me to join them. A renewed assault on the cabin jolted me from my horrified reverie. The scratching at the door intensified, and I could hear wood splintering as something began to force its way inside. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent. "Join us, Ranger," they called. "Become one with the Hollow. Let go of your humanity and embrace eternity." I gripped my weapon tighter, my mind racing. I knew what I was facing now, but that knowledge only made the situation more terrifying. These weren't mindless monsters I could shoot and be done with. These were once people, transformed by forces beyond my comprehension. As the first of the entities began to slither through the gaps in the door, their bodies flowing like liquid shadows, I realized I had a choice to make. I could fight, possibly injuring or killing beings that had once been human, or I could run and hope I could escape the suffocating grasp of Cold Hollow. With a deep breath, I made my decision. I just prayed it was the right one. Fighting wasn't an option. Even if I could bring myself to shoot these creatures, I doubted my bullets would have any effect. My only chance was to run and hope I could somehow make it out alive. As the first shadowy figure began to ooze through the splintering door, I bolted for the window on the opposite side of the cabin. I swung the butt of my pistol at the glass, wincing as shards cut into my hand. The sound of breaking glass drew a chorus of shrieks from the entity's human and animal cries that mixed into something unholy. Without a second thought, I dove through the window, feeling glass tear at my clothes and skin. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me, but there was no time to recover. I could hear them pouring into the cabin behind me, their whispers growing louder, more fevered. Ignoring the pain from my cuts and bruises, I scrambled to my feet and ran. The darkness of Cold Hollow seemed even more oppressive now, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to put as much distance between myself and those things as possible. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear them behind me, their movements unnaturally quiet, but their presence unmistakable. The whispers followed me, filling the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why do you run, Ranger? We offer eternity. We offer understanding beyond your wildest dreams." I gritted my teeth and pushed harder, trying to block out the voices. But with each step, it became more difficult. A strange lethargy crept over me, clouding my thoughts. For a moment, just a moment, I found myself considering their offer. What would it be like to let go of my humanity, to become one with the forest? I shook my head violently, trying to clear the fog. This was how they got you, wore you down mentally and physically, until surrender seemed like the only option. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, something caught my eye. Moonlight, faint but unmistakable. I realized, somehow, I had found my way to the edge of Cold Hollow. With renewed energy, I sprinted toward the light. Behind me, I heard the entities shriek in frustration. They were close, so close. But I had a feeling they couldn't follow me out of their domain. I burst out of the tree line into a moonlit clearing, gasping for breath. The oppressive atmosphere of Cold Hollow lifted immediately, like a heavy blanket being pulled away. I turned to look back and saw them, two shadowy figures standing at the edge of the woods. They made no move to follow me, but their eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, they began to retreat into the shadows of the forest. The last thing I heard before they disappeared entirely was a whisper, carried on the night breeze. "We'll be waiting, Ranger. Cold Hollow is patient. One day, you'll return to us." I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. Hours later, I burst through the door and collapsed on the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. My radio crackled to life. It was Maggie, her voice frantic with worry. Sam, are you there? We've been trying to reach you for hours." I reached for the radio with a shaking hand. "I'm here, Maggie," I managed to croak out. "I'm alive. But even as I said those words, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me was still in Cold Hollow. And deep in my gut, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following my escape passed in a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. I told my story countless times to my superiors, to park officials, even to a team of researchers from a nearby university who specialized in folklore and unexplained phenomena. But with each retelling, I could see the doubt growing in their eyes. They found no trace of the cabins I described, no strange symbols carved into trees, no evidence of the horrifying tableau I had discovered. The few rangers brave enough to venture into Cold Hollow reported nothing out of the ordinary, just another secluded valley in the vast wilderness of the park. As the days turned to weeks, I began to doubt myself. Had it all been some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? But then I'd look down at the scars on my hands from the broken glass, feel the phantom ache in my muscles from that desperate run through the forest, and I'd know it had been real. All of it, the journal I'd taken from the cabin, became my obsession. I pored over it night after night, trying to glean some new insight, some clue that might help me understand what had happened. But the more I read, the more questions arose. I had so many questions now. Who was Jeremiah Blackwood really? What were the entities that inhabited Cold Hollow? And most importantly, why had they let me go? My colleagues treated me with a mix of concern and weariness. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I had cracked under the pressure of the job. There were whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, sidelong glances filled with pity and unease. Even Maggie, who had always been a friend, seemed unsure how to act around me. Maybe you should take some time off, she suggested gently one day. Get away from the park for a while, clear your head. But I couldn't leave. Something was keeping me here, a pull I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. Every night, I dreamed of Cold Hollow, of shadowy figures moving through mist-shrouded trees, of whispers promising secrets beyond human understanding. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the echoes of those whispers still ringing in my ears. As weeks turned to months, I threw myself into my work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. I ventured into the most remote patrols, spending days at a time in the backcountry. My colleagues assumed I was just trying to prove myself again, show that I could still do the job. The truth was, I was searching for something, though I wasn't sure what. It wasn't until one of these extended patrols, nearly 6 months after my encounter in Cold Hollow, that I stumbled upon something I couldn't ignore. I was deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest trail, when I came across a tree unlike any I had ever seen before. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, the bark a sickly grayish white. Carved into that bark was a symbol I knew all too well, a spiral with jagged lines cutting through it. My heart pounded as I approached the tree. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the symbol, half expecting it to burn or shock me. Instead, I felt a strange vibration, a pulse of energy that seemed to travel up my arm and straight to my core. And then I heard it, a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "Welcome back, Ranger. We've been waiting for you." I spun around, my hand instinctively going for my sidearm, but there was nothing there. Just the silent forest stretching out in every direction. Yet, I could feel eyes on me watching from just beyond the veil of reality. Standing there, my mind racing, I realized a terrible truth. Cold Hollow wasn't just a place. It was spreading, reaching out tendrils into the wider world, and somehow, I was connected to it. I knew then that I had a choice to make. I could run, leave the park, forget everything I had seen, and try to move on. Or I could stay, try to understand what was happening, and find a way to stop it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I made my decision. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide from this. Whatever was happening in these mountains, whatever Cold Hollow truly was, I was a part of it now. And I was the only one who could do something about it. With a deep breath, I turned and began the long hike back to civilization. I had research to do, preparations to make. Because I knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated me, that I would be returning to Cold Hollow this time on my own terms. The winter months passed slowly, each day a battle against the growing urge to return to Cold Hollow. I spent my time researching, digging through old records and local folklore for any mention of similar phenomena. I reached out to experts in fields ranging from archaeology to theoretical physics, always careful to frame my inquiries as purely academic. Most of what I found was useless ghost stories and campfire tales that bore little resemblance to what I had experienced. But there were nuggets of information, fragments that hinted at a deeper truth, stories of thin places where the veil between worlds was weaker. Legends of ancient beings that lived in symbiosis with the land itself. As spring began to thaw the frozen landscape, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to go back. I prepared meticulously, gathering supplies and equipment that I hoped would help me navigate whatever Cold Hollow might throw at me. Cameras with infrared capabilities, EMF detectors, even a few items recommended by the more esoteric researchers. I had consulted crystals said to have protective properties, herbs used in ancient warding rituals. I told no one of my plans. As far as my colleagues knew, I was just taking a much-needed vacation. Only Maggie seemed suspicious. Her eyes narrowed as I signed out for 2 weeks of leave. "Be careful out there, Sam," she said, her voice low. "Whatever you're planning, just come back safe, okay?" I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I will," I promised, hoping it wasn't a lie. The hike to Cold Hollow seemed both longer and shorter than I remembered. With each step, I could feel the forest changing around me, becoming denser, more primordial. The bird song faded away, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. As I neared the heart of the valley, a familiar heaviness settled over me. The air grew thick, almost syrupy, and the sickly sweet odor I remembered from my first visit filled my nostrils. And then I saw it, the cabin. It stood exactly as I remembered, its weathered boards and sagging roof a stark contrast to the lush greenery surrounding it. My heart pounded as I approached, every nerve on high alert. The door creaked open at my touch, swinging inward to reveal the dim interior. Everything was as I'd left it. The overturned furniture, the strange symbols on the walls, even the circle of objects in the center of the room remained undisturbed. I set up my equipment with shaking hands, cameras in each corner, EMF detectors placed strategically around the room. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped into the center of the circle. My heart hammering in my chest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cabin remained eerily silent, the only sound the ragged rhythm of my own breathing. Just as doubt began to creep in, as I considered the possibility that I had made a terrible mistake, I felt it, a shift in the air. A change in pressure so palpable that my ears popped. Then the symbols on the walls began to glow, faint but unmistakable. The objects in the circle, the bones, feathers, and stones, started to vibrate, lifting slightly off the floor as though held by invisible strings. And then came the whispers, a soft, unsettling chorus that seemed to rise from every corner of the room, surrounding me with a chilling familiarity. "Welcome home, Ranger," they said, their voices blending together in a low hum that reverberated through my bones. "We've been waiting for you." I steeled myself, resisting the urge to turn and flee as terror rose in my chest. "No," I thought, "I need answers." "I want answers," I said, my voice small in the vastness of the cabin, as if the room itself were swallowing my words. What do you want from me?" The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their echoes wrapping around me like tendrils. The air thickened, shimmered, as though reality itself was bending and warping around us. "We are the old ones," the voices replied. "We are the land, the sky, the trees, and the stones. We have existed here since before your kind first walked upright." As they spoke, my mind was flooded with images, glimpses of a world so ancient and alien that I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. Vast cities of impossible geometry, beings of pure energy moving through dimensions beyond human understanding. "But we are dying," the voices continued, their tone tinged with a note of desperation. The world changes, and we cannot adapt. We need new blood, new minds to join with us, to help us survive. A clarity washed over me, as terrifying as it was oddly comforting. These entities weren't evil, they were simply other. They weren't trying to destroy humanity, they were reaching out the only way they knew how. And me, I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the overwhelming chorus. Why me? The air pulsed again, the energy in the room intensifying. You are special, Samuel Hawthorne, they replied. You can bridge the gap between our world and yours. You can help us, and we can help you. As their words echoed through my mind, I felt something inside me change. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and suddenly I could see and understand things that had always been just beyond my perception. I knew now that I stood at a crossroads. I could reject their offer, try to run, and never return to Cold Hollow. Or I could accept to become something more than human, a bridge between two worlds. As the energy in the cabin reached a fever pitch, reality itself seemed to hang in the balance. I made my choice, and in that instant, everything changed. The world exploded into a kaleidoscope of sensations, colors beyond my comprehension, sounds so alien they threatened to overwhelm my senses. The very fabric of reality bent and shifted around me, and I was caught in its overwhelming beauty and terror. My consciousness stretched beyond the confines of my body. Suddenly, I could feel everything in Cold Hollow. Every tree, every rock, every living thing that called this place home. I was connected to it all, in a way that defied explanation. The old ones surrounded me. No longer the shadowy, half-formed beings I had seen before. I could now perceive their true nature, beings of pure energy, of thought, ancient beyond comprehension. They flowed around and through me, their essence mingling with mine. As the transformation took hold, memories and knowledge flooded into my mind. I saw the birth of Cold Hollow, the mountains, the first primitive life forms that evolved in the forests, the countless civilizations that had risen and fallen, unaware of the ancient beings who had watched from the shadows. With this knowledge came understanding, and with understanding came a profound sadness. I saw why the old ones needed help, why they had reached out to humans. Their time was ending. The world was changing in ways they couldn't adapt to, and they were slowly fading away. They had chosen me and others before me in a desperate attempt to survive, to pass on their knowledge and essence to beings that could thrive in the modern world. It was a symbiosis emerging of human adaptability with their ancient power and wisdom. As the transformation neared its completion, I felt myself returning to my physical form. But I was no longer the same Samuel Hawthorne who had entered that cabin. I was something more, a bridge between two worlds. A keeper of ancient secrets and protector of forgotten lore. The cabin around me had changed too. The symbols on the walls pulsed with living energy, and I could read them as easily as English. The objects on the floor had rearranged themselves into intricate patterns that I instinctively knew were conduits for the old one's power. As I stood there, taking in my new reality, I heard the whispers one last time. The choice is made. The bond is forged. You are one of us now, Samuel Hawthorne. But you are also still human. Use this gift wisely. Protect our secrets, but also protect your world. For our fates are now intertwined. The energy in the cabin began to dissipate, the glowing symbols fading, and the objects in the circle settling back to the floor. But I could still feel the power thrumming through me, a constant reminder of the transformation I had undergone. I stepped out of the cabin on shaky legs, blinking against the sunlight. Cold Hollow looked different now, more alive, more vibrant. I could see the currents of energy flowing through the land, feel the whispers of the trees and rocks in my bones as I made my way back toward civilization. I knew my life would never be the same. I now carried a duty not only to the old ones and to Cold Hollow, but also to the human world that I was still a part of. I had to find a way to balance these two realms, to use my new abilities for the good of both. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, dangers, and difficult choices to make. But as I hiked out of Cold Hollow, I felt a sense of purpose I had never known before. I was Samuel Hawthorne, Park Ranger and guardian of ancient secrets, and my story was just beginning. I was never the type to abandon society, to run from my problems. But after what happened that summer of 1987, I didn't have much of a choice. My name's Ray Morrison, and looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think that isolation could solve my problems. The mill closure hit our town hard. 300 workers, myself included, found ourselves standing in the unemployment line that June. My wife, Catherine, didn't take it well. 23 years of marriage crumbled in the span of 3 months. The constant arguments, the disappointed looks, the growing distance between us, it all became too much to bear. When I saw the ad in the newspaper for a winter caretaker position, it felt like Providence. The Cascade Mountains beckoned with their promise of solitude and purpose. The pay wasn't much, but it included lodging and utilities. More importantly, it offered escape. I remember the day I interviewed with the Hendersons, a wealthy Seattle couple who owned the property. Mrs. Henderson, a tall woman with carefully manicured nails, seemed hesitant about my qualifications. Her husband, though, saw something in my desperation that appealed to him. The isolation gets to some people, he warned, studying me over his wire-rimmed glasses. 6 months is a long time to be alone with your thoughts. I assured him I could handle it. After all, what could be worse than watching your life fall apart piece by piece? The cabin was a sturdy structure, built in the 1940s by logging companies when the area was still actively harvested. It was perched on a slope overlooking what the locals called the Hollow, a wide, mist-filled valley that seemed to swallow sound itself. It had weathered decades of harsh winters and violent storms. The orientation was brief. Mr. Henderson showed me the ancient wood stove, the emergency radio system, and the well out back. They'd recently installed solar panels, providing enough power for basic necessities. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was 30 miles away, an hour's drive in good weather, impossible in heavy snow. Bears are your biggest concern, Mrs. Henderson explained, handing me a thick binder of instructions. Keep your garbage secured, don't leave food outside. The trails are marked, but stick to them, it's easy to get turned around up here. What they didn't mention, what nobody mentioned until it was too late, was the true nature of the hollow, the darkness that lived there, patient and hungry, waiting for someone foolish enough to believe they could handle the solitude. October arrived with a burst of color, painting the mountainside in brilliant reds and golds. I settled into a routine quickly enough. Mornings spent checking the property, afternoons chopping wood or maintaining the grounds. The evenings stretched long and quiet, filled with books I'd been meaning to read for years, and the occasional crackling message over the emergency radio. My first trip into Pine Ridge for supplies introduced me to the local attitude toward the hollow. The town was what you'd expect, a handful of streets lined with weather-beaten buildings, a general store that doubled as the post office, and a small diner serving the same menu since the 1950s. The gas station attendant, a man who introduced himself only as Wade, was the first to hint at something wrong as he filled my truck. His weathered face creased with concern. Morrison, right? The new caretaker up at the old logging cabin? When I nodded, he glanced toward the mountains. Word of advice, get yourself a good lock for that door. And whatever you hear at night, don't go investigating. I laughed it off, but his expression remained grave. I'm serious. Things happen up there. People go missing. At the general store, I got more of the same. Mrs. Reeves, the elderly owner, added extra batteries and candles to my order. You'll want light up there. Lots of it, she said firmly. When I protested, she simply insisted, trust me. I drove back to the cabin that afternoon, truck loaded with supplies, trying to dismiss their warnings as local superstition. But something about their earnestness, the way they wouldn't quite meet my eyes when talking about the hollow, left me unsettled. The first real snow came in mid-November, earlier than usual, according to the Hendersons' notes. I watched it fall from the cabin's front window, thick flakes swirling in the wind, gradually transforming the landscape into something alien and pristine. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up, howling through the valley with an almost human quality that set my teeth on edge. That night, the whispers began. That night marked the beginning of something darker. I had my first nightmare about the place. In the dream, I stood at the cabin's window, watching the snow fall, but something was wrong with the flakes. They fell too slowly, too deliberately, as if they were being controlled. As I watched, they began to form patterns in the air shapes that shouldn't exist, that hurt my eyes to look at. And in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, a figure stood motionless, watching the cabin. Watching me, I woke in a cold sweat. The fire in the wood stove was nearly dead, casting only weak light across the room. The dream had felt so real that I had to check the window to assure myself the snow was falling normally, and there was no figure standing in the darkness. But even after confirming I was alone, sleep eluded me. December arrived, bringing with it a different kind of cold. It wasn't just the physical chill that seeped through the cabin's walls, but something deeper, something more primitive. The first thing I noticed was the silence. One morning, as I stepped outside to bring in more firewood, I realized I couldn't hear anything. No wind in the trees, no distant bird calls, not even the usual creaking of the cabin settling. The silence was absolute, pressing against my ears like a physical force. I stood there, armload of wood forgotten, straining to hear something, anything. The hollow stretched out below me, filled with its usual mist, but it seemed different now. More aware, that's when I noticed the tracks. They appeared overnight, emerging from the tree line and circling the cabin before disappearing back into the forest. Human footprints, impossibly large and barefoot, pressed deep into the fresh snow. I followed them with my flashlight, noting how they showed no signs of hesitation or wandering. Whatever had made them knew exactly where it was going. The tracks led to the well first, then to each window of the cabin in turn, as if something had been looking in while I slept. The thought made my skin crawl. I took photographs with the Polaroid camera the Hendersons had left, documenting the size and pattern of the prints. Looking at the developed pictures only made it worse. There was something unnatural about the way they were spaced to even, to precise. I spent the rest of the day securing the cabin's windows and doors, checking and rechecking the locks. The shotgun, which had seemed like an unnecessary precaution when I first arrived, became my constant companion. I kept it loaded and within reach at all times. That night, the silence broke. It started with footsteps in the snow, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I sat in the dark, the shotgun across my knees, listening as whatever was out there made its rounds. The footsteps would stop occasionally, lingering near the windows before continuing their circuit. Around midnight, I heard something new scratching at the walls. Light at first, then more insistent. It moved from window to window, testing each one. I remained frozen in my chair, barely breathing, as the scratching continued for what felt like hours. When dawn finally came, I found long, deep gouges in the wooden siding beneath each window. They were too high up to have been made by a bear, and too regular to be random damage. Whatever had made them had been trying to get in. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. The tracks appeared regularly now, always in the same pattern, from the trees to the well, then around the cabin. Sometimes they'd stop at the door, as if whatever made them had stood there for hours, waiting. I began keeping a journal, documenting everything: the tracks, the scratches, the sounds in the night. The radio became increasingly unreliable. Static consumed most frequencies, and when I did manage to make contact with the outside world, the connections were brief and filled with interference. During one of these rare clear moments, I tried to explain my situation to the ranger station in Pine Ridge. The ranger on duty listened patiently, then asked a strange question. "Have you heard it calling yet?" Before I could ask what he meant, the radio died completely. No amount of adjustment or repair would bring it back to life. That night, I understood what the ranger meant. I was sitting by the fire, trying to distract myself with one of the books I'd brought, when I heard it. A voice, carrying through the wind, calling my name. At first, I thought I was imagining things, my mind playing tricks after too many days of isolation. But it came again, clearer this time. Ray, it was my father's voice, exactly as I remembered it, down to the slight gravel in his tone from years of smoking. But my father had been dead for 10 years, buried in a cemetery hundreds of miles away in Oregon. Ray, come outside. We need to talk. The voice was coming from just beyond the cabin door. I gripped the shotgun tighter, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The voice continued, moving around the cabin, always my father's voice, but somehow wrong, like something wearing his voice like an ill-fitting suit. Son, please. I've been waiting so long to see you. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice seemed to come from inside my head now. It spoke of things only my father would know, private moments, shared secrets, conversations we'd had in his final days. But beneath the familiar words was something else, something hungry. When morning came, I was huddled in the corner, shotgun clutched to my chest, my throat raw from screaming. The voice had continued all night, growing more insistent, more desperate. The tracks outside were fresh, and this time, they led all the way to the door in the snow. I found a single cigarette butt, my father's brand, lying in the snow near the cabin. The isolation and fear began to take their toll. I lost track of days, marking time only by the appearance of new tracks in the snow and the nightly visits from whatever wore my father's voice. I barely slept, existing in a haze of caffeine and terror. The few times I did manage to sleep, my dreams were filled with glimpses of something vast and ancient, moving in the mist below the cabin. One particularly bad night, after hours of listening to the voice beg and plead in my father's tones, I made a decision. I had to know what was out there. The uncertainty was worse than any truth could be, or so I thought. I waited until dawn, loaded the shotgun, and followed the tracks into the trees. They led down into the hollow, following a path I hadn't noticed before. The mist seemed to part before me, then close behind, cutting off my retreat. The silence was absolute here, broken only by the crunch of my boots in the snow. After what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. The tracks ended at the entrance to what appeared to be an old mine shaft, or relic from the area's logging past, perhaps. The entrance was partially collapsed, but something about it seemed wrong. The angles of the timbers supporting it were bent in impossible ways, and the darkness beyond the entrance was somehow darker than it should have been. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard it again. My father's voice, now coming from deep within the mine. Ray, you finally came. Come see what I found. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I found myself taking a step forward, then another. The darkness seemed to reach out, drawing me in. I raised my flashlight, and in its beam, I saw something that stopped me cold. The walls of the mine weren't rock, they were moving, shifting like living tissue. And carved into them were faces, hundreds of faces, all contorted in expressions of terror. Some I recognized from missing persons posters I'd seen in Pine Ridge. Others were older, their features weathered by time, but still recognizable in their agony. That's when I realized the truth about the hollow. It wasn't just a valley, it was something else. Something that had been there long before the loggers came, before the first settlers arrived, maybe even before humans walked the earth. The cabin, the logging operations, the mine, they were all just scabs on its surface, and it was finally ready to feed again. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, somehow finding my way back to the cabin through the mist. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever lived in the hollow had marked me, and it was patient. That night was the worst. The voice wasn't just my father's anymore. It was a chorus of voices, all calling out to me. I recognized some of them, my wife Catherine, old friends from the mill, even Mrs. Henderson. They begged and pleaded, their voices mixing together in a cacophony of need and hunger. The scratching at the walls became pounding, the whole cabin shaking with the force of it. I huddled in the center of the room, shotgun ready, watching as the windows frosted over with impossible patterned spirals and whirls that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. Around midnight, the pounding stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate steps approaching the door. Then came the knock. 3 slow, measured knocks that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I didn't answer. I couldn't, but the knocking continued, steady as a heartbeat for hours. Just before dawn, I heard a key turn in the lock. The door swung open slowly, revealing a figure that both was and wasn't my father. It had his face, his clothes, even the way he used to hold his cigarette, but its eyes were wrong, deep, hollow things that seemed to contain the same shifting darkness I'd seen in the mine. "Son," it said, in my father's voice, "why did you make me wait so long?" I fired the shotgun. The blast caught the thing square in the chest, sending it stumbling backward. But instead of blood, black mist poured from the wound, and the thing began to laugh, a sound that started as my father's familiar chuckle, but degraded into something inhuman, a sound no human throat could make. I emptied the second barrel into it, then ran past the thing wearing my father's face, through the snow, toward my truck. Behind me, the laughter continued, now joined by other voices, a chorus of mirth that echoed through the hollow. The truck started on the first try, a miracle I'm still thankful for. I drove through the snow-covered roads like a madman, not caring if I slid off the mountain. Anything was better than staying there. In my rearview mirror, I could see shapes moving in the mist behind me, dark figures that seemed to flow rather than walk, all wearing familiar faces. They followed for miles. Their voices carried on the wind, promising everything I'd ever wanted if I just stopped and talked to them. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit Pine Ridge, then kept going. I didn't slow down until I crossed the state line, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When the Hendersons finally reached me by phone, weeks later, asking why I'd abandoned my post, I couldn't find the words to explain. How do you tell someone that their summer home sits on the edge of something ancient and hungry, that the mist in their valley hides things that shouldn't exist? They found my journal in the cabin, along with the Polaroids of the tracks. I don't know what they made of it all. The official story was that I had some kind of breakdown, too much isolation, too much winter. Maybe they're right. Maybe it would be easier to believe that. It's been years now, and I've never gone back to the mountains. I settled in a small coastal town, as far from the Cascades as I could get while still staying in the country. I found work at another mill and rebuilt some semblance of a normal life. But I've never fully escaped what happened in the hollow. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights when the fog rolls in from the ocean, I hear familiar voices calling my name. I've learned to keep the lights on, to fill my home with noise, television, radio, anything to drown out the silence. I've boarded up my well, unable to shake the connection between wells and what lurks in dark places. The missing persons reports from the area around Pine Ridge continue. Every few years, another caretaker vanishes from that cabin, leaving behind confused notes about tracks in the snow and voices in the night. The authorities blame the isolation, the harsh winters, or wild animals. They've never found any bodies. I've thought about warning people, about going public with what I know, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? Recently, I received a letter from Mrs. Reeves, the general store owner in Pine Ridge. Her handwriting was shaky, but her message was clear. The hollow is growing. The mist that once stayed in the valley now creeps into town at night, bringing with it those same impossible whispers. People have started disappearing from their homes, leaving behind only strange tracks in their yards, large barefoot prints that lead nowhere. She enclosed newspaper clippings. 3 hikers vanished last summer, their campsite found intact, but surrounded by those familiar tracks. A forest ranger went missing while investigating reports of strange noises near the old mine shaft. They found his radio 2 weeks later, still broadcasting, but all anyone could hear through it were voices calling his name. The part that chills me most was her description of what happened to Wade, the gas station attendant who first warned me. They found his station empty one morning, the door locked from the inside. Security cameras showed him talking to someone off-screen for hours, though there was no one else in the station. Just before dawn, he walked out into the mist, following what appeared to be his long-dead wife. Neither has been seen since. Last month, I received another package. This one came from a university professor who had been researching the area's history. She'd found my name in old police reports and tracked me down. What she discovered makes me question everything I thought I knew about the Hollow. The indigenous peoples of the region had legends about the valley long before European settlers arrived. They called it the place of hungry shadows and warned that it was a thin spot, a place where the boundary between our world and something else had worn away. Their stories spoke of an ancient entity that lived in the mist, one that could wear the faces of loved ones and lure the unwary into its domain. But it was what she found in the logging company's records that truly shook me. In 1943, during the construction of the cabin, workers broke through into something they shouldn't have. The official report calls it a cave system, but the descriptions match what I saw in that mine shaft. Impossible geometries, walls that seemed to move, and faces in the rock. The company covered it up, but not before losing 12 men to whatever they'd awakened. The missing men's families reported hearing their voices calling from the mist for weeks afterward. The cabin was built as a monitoring station, not a vacation home. The early caretakers were actually there to observe and document whatever was happening in the Hollow. I'm writing this now because I know it's not over. The thing in the Hollow is patient, but it's also hungry, and it's growing stronger. The professor's research suggests that the disappearances are becoming more frequent, and the mist is spreading further each year. It's only a matter of time before it reaches beyond Pine Ridge, beyond the mountains. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard my father's voice, not the twisted version from the Hollow, but his real voice, exactly as I remember it from my childhood. He told me he was sorry, that he should have warned me about the shadows that follow our family. Then the line went dead. I checked the caller ID later. The call came from my old cabin number, a line that was disconnected years ago. To anyone reading this, especially if you're considering taking a caretaker position in the Cascades, or if you're planning a hiking trip near Pine Ridge, remember this: the mist is not empty. The voices you hear in the wind are not your imagination. And if someone you've lost calls your name in the darkness, no matter how real they sound, no matter how much you miss them, don't answer. Because the thing in the Hollow is still there, still wearing borrowed faces, still waiting for someone lonely enough or desperate enough to answer when it calls. And once it learns your voice, once it knows who you love and what you've lost, it never really lets you go. I know this because sometimes, on the darkest nights, I still hear it calling. And sometimes, in my weaker moments, I almost answer. They're building a resort near the Hollow now. The developers didn't listen to the warnings from Pine Ridge locals. They didn't pay attention to the unusually high number of accidents during construction. They see only the pristine wilderness, the mountain views, the chance to profit from people's desire to escape into nature. I've considered going back just once to see what's become of the old cabin, to face whatever still waits in the mist. But I know that's exactly what it wants. That's how it works, drawing you back, making you think you can confront it, understand it, maybe even stop it. The professor who contacted me disappeared 2 weeks ago. Her research notes were found scattered across her office, covered in drawings of spiraling patterns that hurt the eyes to look at. The security footage shows her working late one night when the mist somehow seeped in through her office window. In the last frame, she's walking towards something off camera, smiling like she's seeing someone she knows. I'm leaving these words as a record and a warning. If you find yourself in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest and you come across a valley filled with mist, where the birds don't sing and the shadows move wrong, turn back. If you hear familiar voices calling from the fog, calling you by name, promising answers or comfort or closure, run. But most importantly, if you wake one night to find tracks in the snow, large, barefoot prints that lead to your door, don't follow them. Don't open the door. Don't answer when it knocks. Because the Hollow is hungry, and it's patient, and it remembers every voice it's ever stolen. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear them all calling out from the mist. waiting for someone to answer. The cabinet story, it began around midnight. A faint rustling, like old paper shuffling in a sealed library, broke the stillness. Lying awake in my room, I stared at the faint outline of the wooden cabinet I'd inherited. The cabinet was tall and imposing, carved from dark wood with intricate, stern designs. It had belonged to my great-uncle at least, that's what the lawyer had said. I'd never met the man. He passed without any direct heirs, and through some convoluted chain of forgotten family ties, the property ended up with me. Along with it came the cabinet. I moved in about a week ago, but the place still reeked of varnish and stale carpets. The bedroom was small and perpetually cold, with a dampness that clung to my clothes and skin. I hadn't slept well since arriving. Every night, I'd wake to some unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke each night, heart racing, aware of something wrong, something watching me. At first, I blamed my nerves. This house was my only option after losing my apartment. I had no money and no alternatives. Fixing it up and selling it later was the plan, but the longer I stayed, the more oppressive it felt. The cabinet's doors creaked randomly, even when untouched. Inside, its drawers were filled with old photographs, formal portraits of stern-looking people in dark, outdated clothing. Their gazes were cold and direct, with no children among them. I didn't recognize their faces. They weren't family, at least not anyone from the few albums I had seen. Maybe they were friends or subjects of my great-uncle, who was supposedly a historian. The lawyer didn't offer much detail, and I never cared to ask more. But by my second night, the whispers began. I woke to the sound of shuffling pages, soft and insistent. Voices followed, urgent, unintelligible murmurs. My heart thudded as I flicked on the lamp and stared at the cabinet. The doors were shut, the drawers closed. When I gathered the courage to check, everything seemed in place except for one photograph. It had shifted to the front, a woman in a high-collared dress, her sharp eyes seemingly filled with disapproval. Nervous laughter bubbled out of me. I shut the cabinet and tried to convince myself I'd misremembered the photo's placement. But the tension in my shoulders lingered, and I didn't sleep. By the fourth night, my patience was fraying. Each evening, I double-checked the photo's positions and counted them. 11 in total, 10 men and 1 woman, all dressed in clothing from the late 19th or early 20th century. None smiled, none broke eye contact with the camera. Their expressions seemed defiant, as though they refused to be understood. That night, the whispers came again, pulling me from sleep. Furious, I yanked open the cabinet drawer. The top photo had changed. The man with the mustache looked subtly different. His posture shifted, his narrowed eyes fixed on me. My chest tightened. I felt scrutinized. Desperate, I grabbed the photograph and stormed to the kitchen, flicking on every light. Shaking, I threw it into the trash bin and slammed the lid shut. Relief flooded me, as though a spell had been broken. Returning upstairs, I checked the cabinet. The top photograph was replaced by another man, dressed in the same rigid suit, his expression just as cold. Exhausted, I forced myself to bed, determined to ignore the whispers. Morning came, and I opened the trash bin, expecting to find the crumpled photo inside. It was gone, only coffee grounds remained. Panic set in as I rushed upstairs. The photograph was back in the cabinet, neatly stacked with the others. Cold sweat gathered on my forehead as I touched the edges. They felt brittle, like aged parchment. Determined to end it, I gathered all the photographs, placed them in a cardboard box, and drove to the edge of the property near an overgrown patch of trees. There, I lit a small fire and tossed the box in. I stood back as the flames consumed the cardboard and the frames inside, releasing a foul stench of burnt wood and musty paper. My eyes stung from the smoke, but I stayed until nothing remained but ash and charred scraps. Feeling satisfied, I returned to the house. As I entered the bedroom, nausea rolled through me. The cabinet drawer was slightly open, and the photographs were backstacked neatly inside. Worse, the faces had changed. These weren't strangers anymore. Their bone structures, their eyes, their expressions, they all resembled older versions of me. The woman's sharp features mirrored my own, distorted and dressed in old-fashioned attire. Each set of eyes glared at me, filled with betrayal. I doubled over, my pulse roaring in my ears. This couldn't be real. The nights that followed blurred together half-sleep, constant fear, and restless awakenings. The sounds of pages flipping became louder, clearer. The whispers grew sharper, and now I could almost make out words. They beckoned, half-formed thoughts tugging at the edges of my mind. Come closer, must come closer. I lay drenched in sweat, gripping my sheets, struggling to breathe quietly as if any noise might betray me. My hands shook each time I reached for the cabinet. I tried locking its doors and barricading it with a chair, but nothing worked. By dawn, the photographs always rearranged themselves into a new order. Each face looked more like mine. One even had my exact eyes, complete with the small scar above my left eyebrow. I tried calling for help, but the cell service was too weak, and the landline in the house was dead. Leaving wasn't an option. I had no money and no place to go. This house was supposed to be my last refuge. Still, a sick sense of curiosity rooted me here. I needed to understand what was happening. Late one afternoon, I worked up the nerve to inspect the cabinet thoroughly. Behind the main drawer, I found a small hidden compartment. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, its ink faded and cramped handwriting nearly illegible. I could make out fragments, inheritance, binding, bloodline, and portraits that claim their own. It spoke of faces drawn closer as the cycle completes. A chill ran down my spine as I stuffed the parchment back, heart racing. This was no coincidence. This was tied to my family, and it wanted me. That night, I resolved to stay awake. Around midnight, the whispers began. He's stubborn, one voice muttered. Another replied, quieter. He must step inside willingly. My throat dried at the realization they thought I would climb into the cabinet. The idea was absurd, yet my pulse thundered as if my body believed it. The photographs were talking about me now. My sweat turned cold at the thought of what might happen next. Crawling out of bed, I crept toward the cabinet, each floorboard creaking ominously. I pressed my ear against the wood and felt a faint vibration within, as though dozens of voices crowded a small space. My palms slick with sweat, I pulled the drawer open slightly. It resisted at first, but then slid smoothly, revealing the photographs fanned out like playing cards. The top portrait was now an older, hardened version of my own face. Its eyes glinted with malice. I slammed the drawer shut, nearly catching my fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a knife, I began shredding the photos with furious determination. The brittle paper resisted, and as the blade sliced through, the whispers grew louder and more panicked. For a brief moment, I thought the eyes in the photos darted about, desperate. When I finished, the scraps littered the floor in dozens of pieces. I gathered the remnants into a pillowcase, ran to the kitchen, and stuffed them down the sink. Pouring boiling water over them, I turned the faucet on full blast until the sink overflowed. My hands trembled, but I felt a sliver of hope. This had to work. Yet when I returned upstairs, the photographs were back whole, arranged in a neat fan. They no longer depicted strangers. Every face was mine, captured from different angles, their expressions cold and judgmental. Something inside me snapped. I stumbled onto the bed, gasping for air as the wind outside rattled the windows. The next few nights passed in a haze of sleepless fear. I sat upright, staring at the cabinet and straining to hear the whispers. They spoke of me as though laying a trap. He must lean closer, one voice said. Another added, if we catch his reflection in the glass ... I shivered at the word reflection. The frames of the photographs were glass. Was that how they'd pull me in? If I stared too long, would I see something that dragged me into their world? Desperate, I tried to move the cabinet. It was heavier than it looked, its wood dense and unyielding. Muscles burning, I managed to scrape it halfway into the hallway. That's when the whispers turned frantic, and the wood vibrated under my hands. I lost my grip and stumbled back, scraping my knuckles. In the blink of an eye, the cabinet shifted back into its original position, as if nothing had happened. My lungs constricted, and the very air seemed to turn against me. Every midnight, the voices grow louder. They know I'm afraid. They know I won't leave. And I know they're getting bolder. Last night, I dared to look directly into one photograph. My reflection in the glass smiled back, even though I wasn't smiling. My stomach twisted, and I turned away, heart pounding. My appearance is changing. The bathroom mirror shows it my features sharper, older, more like the stern faces in the photographs. My eyes now carry the same judgmental glint I'd seen staring back at me. Tonight, I lie in bed, my gaze fixed on the cabinet. I've tried everything destroying it, burning the photos, even leaving the house. Nothing works, they always return. I'm trapped, held here by forces I can't fight or flee. The whispers are louder now, the pages turning faster as though flipping through versions of me, deciding which form to take. My breathing is shallow, my body drenched in sweat. I know that as soon as I drift off, they will come for me again. I don't think they can kill me, not directly, but every night leaves me feeling emptier, less certain of what's real. At dawn, I touch my face, and it feels wrong, unfamiliar. My skin tingles, as though the boundary between me and the photographs is wearing thin. Sometimes when I pass by reflective surfaces, I catch movement in the glass, something just out of sync with my own actions. I've stopped looking at myself. What would be the point? No one would believe my story anyway. I have no evidence, no proof, just a growing sense of dread that I'm losing this battle. Each midnight, I sit in the darkness and listen to them. They plot patiently, knowing I'm alone and vulnerable. The cabinet, silent in the daylight, comes alive at night with their murmurs. I feel their stares, their judgment, their hunger. They're waiting for the perfect moment to pull me in. I can feel it, their quiet determination to take me. I haven't escaped, and I don't think I ever will. The photographs remain, locked behind those doors, watching and waiting, their hold on me unrelenting. I'm certain they'll never let me go. The chair, the exact moment I sense it, is etched in my mind. I sat on my couch, still damp from a dash through the rain earlier. The wind rattled the windows, and a faint groan echoed through the hallway behind me. Just a storm in an old house, I reassured myself. Yet, as my anxious eyes darted across the room, I spotted the leather armchair. It looked unchanged, its mustard brown upholstery worn with creases and scratches. I never used it, never touched it. Something about it always felt lifeless, out of place. The chair came with the house, part of an inheritance from an uncle I barely knew. I'd often thought of getting rid of it, but never followed through. Now, I wished I had. That night, it seemed as though the seat was sinking beneath an unseen weight. Invisible, yes, but undeniably real. My heart raced, and I blinked hard, trying to dismiss the sight. Perhaps it was the storm casting strange shadows or the flickering lamp playing tricks on me. But no, the stiff leather cushion was undeniably dipping, as though supporting a heavy body. I tried to ignore it, turning back to the TV and pretending to focus on a late-night rerun. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, though by what, I couldn't say. The hair on my neck bristled as I shifted on the couch, the rough fabric brushing my arms. There was a faint smell in the air, like aged leather mingled with damp earth. Then came the soft squeak of the armchair's springs. The house was old and full of quirks, but this was different. My palms grew clammy, and my toes curled into the rug. I wanted to ignore it, but the sounds became more distinct, like someone shifting to get comfortable. I stood slowly, taking a hesitant step forward. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and I wondered if the unseen presence could hear me too. Reaching the coffee table, I squinted at the chair. The cushion was unmistakably pressed down, then faintly rose and sank again, as though someone were subtly adjusting their posture. My throat went dry, and I retreated to the couch, heart pounding. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in circles around the house. I tried to rationalize the bizarre sight. Maybe the foam in the cushion was defective, or the frame warped from moisture. Yet no logic could explain the slow, rhythmic movement. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat rigid on the couch, my eyes flicking between the hallway, the locked door, and that cursed chair. When dawn finally arrived, the rain had eased, and the air smelled of damp leaves. My eyes were gritty and burning from exhaustion. I decided then and there to get rid of the chair. Not donate it, just throw it outside to rot in the mud. Socks sliding on the floor, I marched to the front door, grabbed the knob, and twisted. It wouldn't budge. Oddly, the lock wasn't even engaged. I tried harder, putting my shoulder into it, but still, it didn't move. Confused, I went to the kitchen door, but it too was stuck, and even the windows seemed sealed tight. The house, it seemed, wouldn't let me leave. Frustrated and unnerved, I returned to the living room, determined to push the armchair over or drag it out of the way. As I approached, a low groan emanated from its frame, like old wood protesting under strain. Then I saw the backrest shift, subtle folds in the leather adjusting, as though someone were settling into it. A cold sensation, like icy fingers, brushed my shoulder. I spun around, but nothing was there, just the stale air and the thudding of my heart. I paced the room, arms crossed tight over my chest, my jaw clenched so hard it ached. Weak morning light filtered through the rain-slick windows, bathing the room in a sickly yellow hue. That's when I noticed a faint discoloration on the floor near the chair's feet. Kneeling, I touched the wood. It was unnaturally cold, and my fingers came away oily. Disgust and dread knotted in my stomach. I needed answers. I rummaged through boxes of my uncle's old papers in the storage closet, searching for a clue. Amidst the clutter of receipts and letters, I found a photograph of the living room from decades ago. The same armchair sat in the same spot. A man with a stern face occupied the seat, his features blurred by the passage of time. On the back of the photo, in my uncle's spidery handwriting, were the words, "Don't move it, ever." A shiver ran down my spine. From the hallway, I stared at the chair. It sat motionless yet somehow oppressive, the leather gleaming faintly in the dim light. The house creaked as if mocking me. My uncle's warning echoed in my head. Did he know about this? Was that why he left the house to me? My fists tightened as my heart pounded, the smell in the room growing stronger, like aged leather mixed with something sour. By midday, exhaustion overtook me. I tried to rest on the couch, but every time I settled, that cold, unseen presence loomed behind me. At one point, I could have sworn something brushed my hair aside, light and deliberate, like a dead hand grazing my scalp. I jumped, banging my knee on the coffee table, cursing through the pain. The chair stayed silent, its cushion molded around an invisible form. Tears welled up from a mix of fear and pain. Desperate, I grabbed a sheet from the linen drawer and approached the chair. The floor was ice cold beneath my bare feet as I tossed the sheet over it. But the fabric snagged midair, catching on something unseen, as if over a shoulder. A stifled cry escaped my throat. I forced the sheet down, and it draped unevenly over the chair. For a fleeting moment, I saw it, a vague, bulky human outline beneath the cloth. My heart raced so violently I could hardly stand. As I stared, the sheet dipped where a head might be, tilting upward as though looking at me. I stumbled back, and the sheet slid off, soundlessly falling to the floor. Panicking, I rushed to the door, yanking at the handle and screaming in frustration. The door wouldn't budge. I tried the windows, pounding on the glass, but nothing gave way. My phone was useless, the power flickered, and the entire house seemed to hum with tension, as if it held its breath. As evening fell, shadows stretched longer, and the room felt even heavier. I found myself whispering to the chair, pleading, "What do you want?" My voice sounded unfamiliar, trembling. I circled the room under the faint glow of a single lamp. Its weak light glinted off the chair, highlighting every crease and scratch in its leather. Had they always been that deep? At one point, I considered burning it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed matches, and returned to the chair. My hands shook so badly that I dropped most of the matches onto the floor. Finally, I lit one, but as I brought it closer, a cold gust snuffed out the flame. Again and again, it happened, an icy breath from nowhere, asserting its control. Nausea overtook me, and I stumbled to the bathroom, retching into the sink. Looking into the mirror, I hardly recognized my reflection, wide-eyed, sweaty, and unkempt. For a moment, I thought I saw something behind me in the doorway, a faint silhouette of a head and shoulders. I spun around, but nothing was there, yet the reflection had shown it, just a second earlier. My heart thundered as I backed into the hallway, moving as quietly as possible. The house felt alive now, its walls almost leaning inward. Back in the living room, I noticed something new. The chair had shifted slightly, no longer facing the TV, but angled toward me. The sour smell was stronger. An image of the photograph flashed in my mind, the stern-faced man who had once sat in the chair. Was he still here, in some way? Night fell hard, with rain tapping insistently at the windows. I paced the room, massaging my temples as a sharp ache settled between my shoulders. Every time I looked at the chair, it seemed to shift slightly, the leather rippling like shallow breaths. I tried to shove the coffee table aside in frustration, but it caught on a warped floorboard. My emotions boiled over, and I shouted, "Leave me alone!" My voice cracked. The only response was a faint squeak from the chair's springs. I collapsed onto the couch, trembling, when I felt it a firm, cold grip on my shoulder. I screamed, jerking forward, but nothing was there. The sensation lingered, leaving a chilling ache in my muscles. As time dragged on, my eyelids grew heavy, but I couldn't fully rest. Every time I drifted off, faint whispers like secrets told by creaking leather would pull me back. At one point, I dared to glance at the chair's reflection in the glass of a cabinet door. A faint silhouette was there, a broad head, shoulders, and hands gripping the armrests. My pulse roared in my ears as I stared, frozen. When I looked back at the chair itself, nothing was visible except the indent in the cushion. My thoughts spiraled as desperation clawed at me. I tried to break a window with a dining chair, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was as solid as stone. When I turned back, the armchair had shifted again, now facing me squarely. It dominated the room, its presence inescapable. I felt trapped, watched, and judged. Tears welled in my eyes as I dropped to the floor, unable to fight any longer. The storm outside raged, while inside, I waged a silent, losing battle against something I couldn't name. In the final hours of that torturous night, I slumped against the wall, my body shaking with silent sobs. Exhaustion took hold, and I raised my head one last time to look at the glass cabinet. For a fleeting moment, the silhouette in the reflection was clearer than ever, a broad figure leaning forward, studying me with dark, unrelenting curiosity. I blinked, and the silhouette vanished, leaving the reflection of an empty room. Yet the chair's real cushion still bore weight, as though mocking me by showing what should be while I endured the reality. Dawn's pale light crept through the windows. My lips were dry, my throat raw. I tried the front door once more, and this time, it opened easily without resistance. Outside, the world seemed normal: wet grass, distant trees, and a dull gray sky. I stumbled into the muddy yard. Looking back, the chair still sat framed in the doorway. I could swear it moved slightly, but I turned away, heart racing, and slammed the door shut. I never returned to that house. I left the property for good, driving away as soon as the car started. Days later, I found myself flinching at every small noise, glancing over my shoulder as though expecting someone or something was following me. Store windows reflected shadows that seemed to linger just behind me. My skin never stopped feeling cold, as if touched by unseen fingers. Even now, writing this from a cramped motel room, I catch glimpses of faint shapes and reflective surfaces. The memory of that armchair weighs heavily on me, the invisible occupant, the cold pressure on my shoulder, and the soft creak of leather. Though I left the house, I doubt I left it empty. Something remains, clinging to me, waiting for a moment to remind me. And every time I see my reflection, I fear I might see it standing there once more. Footprints. Leaning against the wall, I rubbed my tired eyes, then froze. Wet prints clung to the ceiling beams above me, as if someone had walked upside down through the dust. My heart jolted. I straightened and stared, blinking hard, hoping it was a trick of the light. But no matter how long I looked, the prints remained. They glistened faintly, their edges uneven, as if something cold and alive had left them. My neck ached as I tilted my head to see them better. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. This house had been in my family for decades, though I hadn't stepped inside for years, not since I left for a cramped city apartment. I'd only come back because my uncle had asked me to clear it out for sale. I never liked this house. It was too large, too quiet, its corners always shadowed with unpleasant secrets. But I never imagined I'd find anything like this. The basement, in particular, had always unnerved me. Now it felt alive. I stepped closer, my boots scraping softly against the concrete. A sharp, damp smell, like wet stone, hit my nose. The footprints were oval-shaped, almost like shoes, but with pointed toes. They radiated an unnatural chill. Trembling, I reached up and brushed my fingers against one of the darkest marks on the beam. My hand came away moist, as if dipped in icy dew. Shivering, I stumbled back, careful not to disturb the footprints further. The door to the basement was locked from the inside, and I was alone. No one could have been here, but the logic of these prints defied explanation. Scanning the basement, my eyes landed on the tall, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. Its tarnished frame was etched with swirling patterns, its surface specked with age. I remembered it from childhood, always covered by a sheet, always shoved into some dark corner. Now it stood uncovered, reflecting the weak light of a single bulb. For a moment, I saw my own distorted reflection in the cracked glass. Then, from the corner of my vision, I caught a ripple of faint movement. I spun around, but there was nothing. The footprints remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned on the lumpy mattress in the upstairs bedroom, my ears straining to catch any sound. Several times, I thought I heard wet, slapping noises beneath the floorboards, but when I sat up, the house was silent. By morning, I forced myself back into the basement. The footprints had moved. Now they lined the sidewall, trailing vertically toward the mirror as if something had walked straight up it. I cursed it under my breath, my stomach churning. Running a hand over my stubbled chin, I tried to think rationally. Maybe it's water, I told myself. Maybe it's seeping through cracks and drying into patterns. But why these shapes? And why did they keep changing locations? I knelt to inspect them again. They were still moist, still cold to the touch. The faint mineral smell was stronger than before. Each time I checked, the footprints seemed closer to the mirror. For days, I tried to focus on my work. I moved boxes upstairs, sorted old documents, stacked furniture for donation. But every morning, the footprints were somewhere new, spiraling up beams, looping across walls, even coiling near the base of the mirror. Whenever I approached the mirror, my reflection felt wrong. My movements were delayed, or the angles were off, as if the world behind the glass didn't match mine. On the fourth day, I decided to cover it. I draped a thick plastic tarp over the mirror, hammering a nail into the beam to secure it. For extra measure, I hung an old quilt over the tarp. Then I swept the floor, letting the dust settle, trying to ignore the clammy sensation crawling up my arms. For the first time in days, I felt like I'd regained some control. But as night fell, I realized how wrong I was. When I returned that evening after running errands, I found the basement exactly as I feared. The tarp and quilt I had painstakingly secured over the mirror were tossed aside, crumpled in the corner. The footprints had returned to the ceiling, but now they formed a jagged, zigzagging trail, almost as if in frustration. My breath caught in my throat, my heartbeat a deafening drum in my ears. Flipping the overhead light switch on and off changed nothing. The mirror stood uncovered, its tarnished surface catching the faint sheen of sweat on my forehead as I stared at my rigid reflection at the bottom of the stairs. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, to abandon this place, to run and never look back. But I had promised my uncle I would finish clearing the house, and I needed the money from selling it. Beyond that, a gnawing curiosity had taken root in me, a desperate need to understand. Sometimes they resembled arrows pointing toward the mirror. Other times, They formed spiraling patterns that made my head spin if I stared too long. I began sketching their positions, trying to find meaning. But my hands trembled as I worked, my breath growing shallow, a crawling sensation prickling the back of my neck. It felt as though unseen eyes were following my every move. "What do you want?" I whispered into the empty room one night, my voice cracking. The footprints were still and silent, dark ovals glistening faintly along the ceiling beams. Summoning courage, I approached the mirror, heart hammering in my chest. "Is someone there?" I asked my reflection, pale and tense, staring back at me. Nothing replied. But as I turned to leave, a flicker caught my eye, a subtle distortion in the mirror, like my reflection had shifted a second too late. By the end of the week, I was unraveling. Sleep had become a distant memory. My head throbbed constantly, and my mouth carried the bitter taste of copper. Every creak of the old wooden floors made me jump, and though I tried to avoid the basement, I couldn't stop checking it. On a particularly tense afternoon, I decided to investigate the back of the mirror. Removing it from its leaning position, I discovered something taped to the wooden backing, a faded photograph. The image showed a figure standing in the basement, holding a lantern. The person's face was blurred, indistinct, but behind them, faint footprints were visible on the walls. My stomach churned. The patterns, the footprints, they weren't new. Someone else had witnessed this. The mirror had to be connected. Was it a gateway? A window into a place where gravity twisted and strange beings walked along walls and ceilings. That night, I stood in front of the mirror with a flashlight. The footprints had arranged themselves into a circle directly above me. My pulse thundered as I stared at my reflection, raising my hand slowly. My reflection mirrored the movement perfectly. But as I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cold glass, the mineral smell grew stronger. My throat tightened as I reached out and touched the surface. The glass was icy, almost unnaturally so. Pressing harder, I felt a resistance like pushing through thick, invisible jelly. Above me, the footprints began to glisten, droplets forming at their edges and dripping onto my shoulder. I recoiled, wiping my neck with a trembling hand. My lamp flickered, and my legs felt like they might give out. "Stop this," I muttered weakly, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. I dared to look at the mirror again, and this time, something was wrong. My reflection's eyes were darker, shadowed, and the shape of my mouth looked slightly twisted. I blinked, and my reflection blinked back, but not in sync. Panic clawed at my chest as I stumbled back, nearly falling over a pile of books. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave the basement, maybe even the house. But who would believe me? Nothing was broken. No one had died, and yet I felt myself unraveling, my mind fracturing. I gathered my courage and grabbed the quilt from the floor, determined to cover the mirror and drag it out of the house. But as I approached, something icy grazed my forearm like a cold fingertip. I gasped and jumped back, shining my flashlight around wildly. Nothing, just me and the silent tormentor. Then the footprints began to move. I watched in horror as they shifted, seeping along the wood, forming a long line that stretched toward the corner where the mirror stood. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I had to decide: run now and leave everything behind, or face this thing head on. I thought of my uncle, of my promise, and I knew there was no turning back. I thought of the photograph I had found, the blurred figure holding a lantern, the faint footprints on the walls. Someone had encountered this before, leaving that photo as a warning or perhaps as a clue. My teeth clenched as I lunged forward, throwing the quilt over the mirror. The fabric clung for a moment, and I pressed my palm against it, holding it tightly in place. The air around me grew icy, sinking deep into my joints and making my entire body ache. Beneath my hand, I felt a rattling vibration, as though something on the other side of the glass was trying to push through. My vision blurred with tears, and I pressed harder, praying silently for it to stop. Then, all at once, the rattling ceased, the chill lightened, though it didn't disappear entirely. I stepped back, trembling, tears streaking down my face. The footprints above me remained dark patches of moisture clinging to the ceiling, but they didn't move. They seemed subdued. At least for now. I left the basement, locking the door behind me. My legs felt like jelly, barely able to support my weight. That night, I managed only a few hours of fitful sleep. Every creak of the house's old pipes jolted me awake, my heart pounding as though the walls themselves were whispering warnings. By morning, I noticed a thin layer of condensation beneath the basement door, as if something was breathing on the other side. My reflection in the hallway mirror was gaunt, hollow-eyed. My pupils seemed darker, my movements slightly off, as though my image had become disconnected from me. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I had to leave. Packing my things in haste, I promised myself I would never return. The house was unsellable anyway. Who would want a place like this? As I passed the stairwell, a faint drip, drip, drip reached my ears. I knew if I opened the basement door, I'd see the footprints again, perhaps even handprints trailing in impossible patterns across the walls and ceiling. I knew the mirror waited, hidden but never truly contained. Before stepping out, I paused for a final glance in the small mirror by the front door. My reflection tilted its head slightly, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. My stomach turned, and I ran my tongue over dry lips, forcing myself not to linger. The danger wasn't gone. It was waiting. The next time I saw a reflection, I feared I'd find those footprints behind me or feel that icy presence hovering at my shoulder. If I ever returned to this house, I knew the old mirror would still be there, its hidden world pressing closer to mine. I swear I still feel the chill crawling up my neck as I sit here, trying to steady my breath. Even now, the walls seem to press inward, knowing something I don't. It started with the mask. The house had been mine for only a few weeks, ever since my aunt passed and left it to me. At first, it felt like a half-hearted blessing, old, silent, and heavy with history. I thought I could fix it up, sell it, and move on. No one else in the family wanted it. But tonight, the air feels charged, alive, as if something unseen is watching. I stand in the upstairs hallway, staring at the attic door, my breath shallow. My thoughts drift to earlier in the evening, when I found the mask, pale ceramic, its blank white face subtly marked by faint brush strokes around the eyes. The mask was tucked away in a battered cardboard box, behind an old wardrobe in the attic. The air up there was damp, heavy with the scent of rot and stale wood. I'd gone up looking for something valuable, or at least some clue about my aunt's life. Instead, I uncovered this pale face buried beneath yellowed newspapers and dusty doilies. The moment I touched it, a sharp, electric sensation shot up my spine, leaving my stomach clenched and queasy. The ceramic was unexpectedly warm under my fingertips, its cracked glaze discolored at the edges. Curiosity compelled me to bring it downstairs. I hung it on the living room wall, thinking it might add a bit of character. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Each time I passed the mask, I could swear its expression shifted. Subtle changes, never overt, but enough to leave my heart pounding. By midnight, I paused to examine it by moonlight. Tiny fractures had formed across its surface, the lines faintly resembling a twisted grin. I tried to lift the mask from the wall, but it wouldn't budge, as though the hook had bent. Frustrated, I left it there and went upstairs to bed. The uneasy energy in the house kept me awake. As I lay there, the faint sound of a muffled laugh drifted up from downstairs, low, scratchy, as if filtered through thick fabric. I froze, holding my breath. Was it the pipes? A branch scraping the siding? I convinced myself it was nothing, but the sensation of being watched lingered. When I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I dreamed of something unpleasant, though I couldn't remember what. I woke suddenly in the early hours, throat dry, heart hammering. My neck ached as I fumbled for the bedside lamp, blinking against the harsh light. That's when I saw it. The mask was lying on the bed beside me, its smooth, pale face tilted slightly toward mine, as though it had been gently placed there. My stomach flipped, and a cold sweat broke over me. I know I left it downstairs. There was no one else in the house. My fingers trembled as I reached out and brushed against the cool ceramic surface once more. The moment I touched it, a pulse of unease shot through me, and I recoiled, my hand shaking. Backing into the headboard, I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. Did I sleepwalk? The idea made my skin prickle with sweat. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the door. It was locked from the inside. I distinctly remembered turning the key before I went to bed. How could this have happened? Too scared to sleep, I sat upright for the rest of the night, my gaze locked on the mask where it lay face up on the floor. Its cracks seemed deeper now, forming a subtle but mocking smile. It didn't move, but I could feel it waiting, watching. By morning, sunlight streaming through the curtains gave me enough courage to pick it up again. My hand trembled as I carried it downstairs, placing it carefully on the coffee table. The living room felt unchanged. The old furniture, the musty rug, the persistent smell of damp wood. But the mask seemed alive in the pale light. Its cracks traced intricate patterns around the eye holes, delicate yet unsettling. If I stared at it long enough, I almost saw something behind its empty gaze, and intelligence sizing me up. Needing answers, I rummaged through the old papers in the study. There were faded letters, receipts, and handwritten notes, but nothing about a mask. Tucked in a drawer, I found a few Polaroids of my aunt. She was smiling next to people I didn't recognize, all dressed in outdated clothing. In one photo, I spotted something hanging on the wall behind her, a shape that could have been the mask or something eerily similar. In another image, a group of people stood around an ornate wooden box, their expressions grim. The mask wasn't visible, but I sensed a connection I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the unease. Over lunch, I chewed absent-mindedly, barely tasting the food. The mask remained on the coffee table, visible from the kitchen. It felt like an uninvited guest, silent, yet oppressive. By dusk, the tension in my chest returned. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I fetched a spare sheet from the closet and draped it over the mask, hiding its unsettling grin. Out of sight, out of mind. Exhausted, I climbed the stairs and tried to prepare for another restless night. As I lay in the dark, my heart thudded steadily. For a while, there was only silence. No creaks, no whispers, nothing. Just as I began to hope I might sleep, I heard it again, that muffled laugh. It was closer this time. I bolted upright, breath caught in my throat. The sound came from the other side of my bedroom door. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept into the hallway, bare feet against the cold wooden floor. The boards groaned under my weight as I descended the stairs. The living room was dim. My stomach dropped. The sheet I had draped over the mask was gone, neatly folded on the armchair. And there it was, hanging on the wall again. Its cracks had deepened further, carving a jagged, manic grin into the ceramic. I aimed the flashlight, my hand trembling so much the beam wobbled. As I watched, the mask's surface rippled just slightly, like a living thing flexing beneath its skin. I stumbled back, knocking over a side table. A vase toppled and hit the floor with a dull thud. Panicked, I tried to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Destroy it, I thought. Smash it. Burn it. But the idea filled me with dread. Some instinct warned me that breaking it wouldn't solve anything. I felt the mask's pull, its silent demand. It wanted me to wear it. The thought was absurd, but it clung to me. What would happen if I gave in? Would I lose myself behind that porcelain grin? My hands grew clammy as I reached for it. The moment my fingertips brushed its edge, I felt a pulse, a heartbeat thudding against my palm. I gagged, jerking away as nausea twisted in my stomach. The air grew colder, carrying the acrid scent of burnt dust and old paper. I fled to the kitchen, desperate for a solution. I thought about calling someone, but who would believe me? Picking up the phone, I heard only static before slamming it down in frustration. My reflection in the microwave's glass door caught my eye. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror. Behind me, in that distorted reflection, the mask was there, peering from the hallway. Its grin had stretched further, the cracks spreading. Tiny ceramic flakes fell to the floor, their brittle sound like snapping bones. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Turning back to the reflection, the mask was closer. This had to end. I crept back into the living room, the mask hanging innocently on the wall, blank and still under the dim lamplight. Standing beneath it, sweat trickling down my temples, I made my choice. I reached up, my trembling fingertips brushing against the mask. The cracked lines felt like scars under my touch. Slowly, I lifted it off the hook, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it. For a fleeting moment, I considered putting it on, hoping that perhaps doing so would end this nightmare, that it would release me. But the idea of placing the mask over my face made my chest tighten like a vice. Instead, I wrapped it tightly in the sheet again and shoved it into a box. Dragging the box into the hallway closet, I slammed the door and locked it, the key turning with a metallic finality. It was a poor solution, but I needed a moment to think. Back upstairs, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm myself. My throat was raw, and my heart refused to settle. Glancing at the bathroom mirror, I froze. My eyes looked unfamiliar darker, the skin around them taut, as if drawn by invisible wires. For a moment, I swore I saw faint cracks etched near my temples, delicate yet undeniable. I reached up, touching them, and they vanished. Just my imagination, I told myself, swallowing hard. Just stress. Returning to my bedroom, I locked the door and shoved the dresser against it for good measure. The wind picked up outside, branches scratching against the glass like brittle fingernails. I tried to ignore the memory of muffled laughter or shifting grins and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion pulling at me. I must have dozed off briefly, but I was jolted awake by a soft scraping sound inside the room. My throat tightened. Flicking on the lamp, I scanned the room. Nothing. Then I looked down. A tiny ceramic chip lay on the floor beside my bed, its glaze glinting faintly in the light. My breath caught. How had it escaped the closet? Raising the chip with trembling fingers, I stared at it, cold dread pooling in my stomach. My eyes flicked toward the bedroom window, and in the faint reflection, I saw it. A grin. It wasn't my own. The corners of my mouth were stretched unnaturally upward in the glass, even though I wasn't smiling. I tried to straighten my expression, but my cheeks twitched as if pulled by invisible strings. The chip slipped from my hand, landing with a soft click on the wooden floor. I can't fully explain what's happening. Even now, as I sit here trapped in these old rooms, I know the mask isn't done with me. It whispers without sound, waiting just beyond the door. Tomorrow, I might leave if I find the courage, but as the air thickens and my heart pounds against my ribcage, I can feel the mask pressing closer. It's drawn to the fragile barriers of my identity, ready to consume me. If I'm not careful, I'll wear it. And if I do, I may never see my own face again.